Snow fell in soft veils over the gods' wood the morning he set the crown upon her head. The heart tree watched, its red sap frozen at the edges, its carved face seeming to squint against the brightness. The weir had seen older kings and stranger vows, blood beneath its boughs and prayers that never found words, and now it witnessed a brother's hands trembling as he lifted circlet to sister, iron touched with silver and pale stones cut like flakes of ice. The people who had gathered pressed close, their breath a fog among the branches, their boots chewing the frost-choked earth, their silence reverent as a cloister. Sansa bowed her head, the copper of her hair threaded with frost. She had told him she did not want ceremony, and then planned every step of it herself, as if the work of order steadied her against the old chaos. The crown had been hammered quietly in the armory over a fortnight, shaped from iron reclaimed from a half-sunk portcullis and the broken links of a great chain once thrown across the Wintertown road to hold back raiders. The smith had filed it smooth and set those pale stones in it, bits of quartz and moon milk, tokens from 1,000 years of riverbeds and caves, all of it bound to a narrow circlet that felt cold in Jon's hands when he lifted it. "On your knees, your grace," he said, because the form of it mattered, and perhaps because saying the words helped him believe that all this was real and not another dream clawing at the edges of his mind like the cold. Sansa's mouth twitched. "You're a poor jester, Jon. I've never been one for jests." Her gaze flicked to him. "Nor for crowns." He thought of a secret name whispered in a crypt and another spoken in a shattered throne room, of blood and burden. He thought of men who had followed him beyond sense into storms and blackness because he had asked them to. He thought of a girl who had been a child once, who had wanted tales and tapestries and songs from a golden city where the smell of lemon cakes drifted through summer windows. A girl who had come home bearing scars no song would ever wash clean. He thought, not for the first time, that perhaps each of them had been a crown for the other all along, a weight they had worn more easily together. "Bend the knee, Sansa Stark," he said again, and his voice was steadier. She breathed out and knelt, and he lowered the circlet onto hair that smelled faintly of ashwood smoke and clean snow. Wind came down from the broken tower with a sigh that sounded almost like the old gods approving. When she stood, the pale stones caught what little sun there was and found a way to shine anyway. The people of the north, their people, raised their voices. It was not the thunder of drums or the brazen cry of trumpets, but the layered, stubborn sound of 1,000 throats that had weathered lean winters and iron years. "Sansa! Sansa! The North remembers!" The words rolled through the trees as if the bark itself spoke them. Sansa did not smile. She did not weep. She lifted her hands to quiet them and spoke in a voice that found the marrow of the morning and warmed it. She promised stores of grain under every keep and a reckoning for those who preyed on hunger. She promised roof repairs and timber rights adjudicated fair. She promised to seat wise women on councils and to tithe iron and wool towards the roads that had chewed too many axle pins and ankles. She promised watchfires kept at every tower seat, not because of white walkers. They were smoke now, ash on the wind, a tale, but because the North had learned that darkness wore 1,000 faces, and prudence was only another word for memory. And then she said she would keep faith, and that was all. After, the feast boiled out from the hall like steam from a stew pot. Drums appeared anyway, and a piper, and a boy who had made a drum from a soup kettle and 2 strips of leather and would not be denied. Jon ate little. A heel of bread, a bowl of mutton stew steaming like a battlement in winter fog. The warmth of it pooled in his chest and did not spread. He felt hollow and full and exhausted and restless, all at once. Ghost slept beneath the high table, his flanks rising and falling, one ear twitching whenever the piper hit a note that scraped bone. Sansa's eyes found him eventually. He had stood on the periphery, saying words meant for ears that wanted to hear them, a dozen different answers to a dozen grateful faces. Yes, the Queen would ride to White Harbor when the roads were fit. Yes, there would be tar and pitch for ships. Yes, there would be firewood in Wintertown. Yes, there would be a levy for orphans. He answered and shook hands and did not feel any of it. "Walk with me," she said, when she could slip away, her crown a narrow line above her temples. He fell in beside her, and they threaded the corridors of Winterfell. The scents, the sounds, the deep-throated hum of the place, familiar as his own heartbeat. The walls gave back their steps quietly. The snow-wet air bit at the corners of his eyes. It felt like leaving already, and perhaps she sensed it. "I'll say it again," she said, when they reached a terrace that looked over the yard, where a knot of men tried to teach a hound to fetch a snowball and the hound refused on principle. "You could have worn it. The North would have accepted you. They would have accepted a ghost with stark bones," he said. "I've had enough of thrones, Sansa. Is this truly what you want?" she asked quietly. "To leave? Now?" He thought of flames curling like black silk around the stone shoulders of a great beast as it rose from a ruined city. The last dragon had flown eastward once, bearing grief away into a sky that did not care. He thought of 2 eggs, hard and dull as river stones, that had warmed half-forgotten in a chest beside old furs and scrolls, and how the chest had been taken to the cellars for safety, and how flames in a hearth in a small, shadowed room had begun to lick at iron that had not been heated. He thought of a boy with a face like a map of wind, who had told him the dragons were never truly singular creatures. Fire called to fire, and what answered always had a shape. "Drogon came back," Jon said. The words lay between them like something that could burn. Sansa's lips parted, and she went very still. "You were certain?" Her voice was taut, like a harp string tightened for a song that might cut fingers. "I saw him a fortnight ago. He circled the Dreadfort at dawn. I was on the battlements of the East Tower. He filled the sky." Jon's mind had preserved the angles of it too exactly. Dark as a thunderhead, the ripple of wings like a banner, the sound of them the sound of a door in the world opening. He did not come down. He looked. Then he turned east and was gone again. East. Sansa's hand found the frost-rimed stone of the parapet, beyond the narrow sea. "He was thinner," Jon said softly, "scarred. But the fire in him, I could feel it on my face. I thought he would set the whole yard alight, and part of me hoped he would." She looked at him. "Jon, I know," he said, and he did. He had killed the woman whose fire had scorched a city and burned a bell's song from its tower. He had wept with the soot of that city in his hair. Drogon had taken her away with a tenderness that never left his nights. Jon had sworn he would not seek the dragon, had sworn to the quiet of the far north that he would remain in the snow and let the world continue without him. But the world, he had discovered yet again, was stubborn and did not care for vows if it wanted something. "There were eggs in the cellars," he said. "2. I did not tell anyone until I had to. They might have been stones and nothing more, but they weren't." Sansa swallowed, the line of her throat tight. "Where are they now?" "With me." "Warm," Jon said. "I think Drogon smelled them, or whatever sense tells a dragon there is another fire to tend. The old stories say dragons were drawn to Valyria as if to a wound that never closed," Sansa said, and Jon blinked because he had not known she still read tales at night when the castle slept. "There are places in the world where things begin and end, and dragons are a thing like that." "You mean to follow him?" Jon nodded. She was silent a long time. The piper found a tune below them that made the yard sound briefly like a garden in the south where no winter lived. When she spoke, her voice was soft and even. "If you go as my brother and return as my brother. You go with my leave as queen in the north, and with the north's blessing. I will not have whispers." "I don't go as king," Jon said, and the words were curiously lightning. "I go as a man who owes a debt." "To whom?" "To him," Jon said, and did not say her name. Sansa's palm rested against his forearm, the weight of it anchoring. "Bring your debts to me. I like to trace them until they end. You have a realm to trace." He glanced at the arch of stones that made the terrace, the way icicles were forming under the eaves in long glass teeth. "I have a road east." "Who goes with you?" She did not ask if. It was the gift of her. She could set aside what she wanted for what must be. "Davos will, if he agrees." "Of course he will. And one of the Manderley ships will run us to White Harbor and east out of the Bight. We'll hug the coast." I won't take a whole fleet and risk a home's bread on a madman's journey." "You are not a madman," Sansa said. "Men don't decide that about themselves." He breathed a little laugh and felt it fog in his chest. "Arya will be elsewhere. She has her own path and sail to west of west. It is beyond maps. Bran." He let the name dissolve because to speak his brother's otherness directly felt like breaking the surface of a lake with one's bare hand in midwinter. "Bran will know. And Ghost." Jon looked down at the pale heap under the table within, the slow shift of ribs. "Ghost goes where I go." He thought of the first time he had carried the little scrap of fur that smelled of milk and blood. How he had understood that some loyalties were not chosen but found you and settled their bones in your bed and your heart and asked for meat and a steady hand. Sansa nodded once. When she spoke again, her voice found iron. "I will support you publicly from White Harbor to the last hill in the north. I will call your journey a northern voyage, a pact of watch with the eastern seas. If any lord asks me why, I will say, because my brother listens when the wind speaks. The old gods like sailors who do not argue." Jon felt something in his chest bend and then right itself like a mast before a gust. He had not understood how much he had needed permission until it was given. "Thank you," he said. "You will write if you can. If I can. And take men who can bear the truth without unmaking it in their mouths," she said sharply, as if she had just remembered what men's tongues could do. "No singers who build a lie around something true. I won't have you return to find a ballad has eaten you up from the bones outward." He smiled and it came easier. "I don't sing." "Good." She squeezed his forearm and let go. Her eyes were very blue in the winter light. "Come back," she said, and it was not a command or a plea, but a simple fact spoken as if facts could pull a ship through a storm. He bowed his head. In his mind, the dragon was a black stitch across a sky that could not hold him. In his arms that night, the eggs were heavier than they had been the day before. They left at dawn 3 days later, a procession that pretended it was not one because to admit ceremony might invite the eyes of things that disliked the careful labors of men and women. Davos came smiling with his sea-weathered face and the knowledge of 100 shoals stitched into the calluses of his hands. He had looked at the eggs and said, "7 save us," in the tone of a man who knew what saving cost. He had gathered 3 sailors from White Harbor and 5 from the Fingers. Time Stonehouse, who could mend a sail in his sleep and had once chased a seal with a harpoon because it had stolen his glove. Sarah Glover, whose father had been thrown from the mast in a storm and who had never forgiven the sky. The Talad brothers, whose mother had been a Gulltown salt wife and whose father might have been any man who ever went to sea. And Old Mail, who was not old by any measure except his eyes, which were 60 years older than his face. They rode east to White Harbor along a road that Sansa's new men had just begun to patrol. Watchfires guttered on hills like little hearts, and people came out to watch from windows and fields, their backs bent, their faces pale with cold, their waves shy but persistent. Jon slept 2 nights under the stars because he wanted to hear them. Arya had once told him that if you listened hard enough, the stars spoke. He did not hear words, only a distant hum like the memory of a battlefield, but that was language enough. In White Harbor, Lord Manderley embraced them and sent them on with warehouses opened and a ship chosen. The Sea Runner, low and fast and stubborn as a cat. Its hull had been tarred recently and shone like a black stone. A wolf banner snapped at the stern beside the leaping merman, which amused the Manderley men and made the Stark men uneasy, but no one took it down. The Sea Runner smelled of pitch and salt and old fish and new rope. The eggs were cradled in a narrow cabin near the keel where the water's voice could find them. Jon took the berth beside them and was not ashamed of it. They slipped out of the harbor at dawn under a watercolor sky. The gulls sounded like laughter torn from someone who had not laughed in a long time. The water took them and remade their legs and their breaths and the measure of their days. Davos settled into the Sea Runner as if it had been built for him and gave orders with the softness of a man who had learned how to make men listen. Ghost hated the deck when it pitched but loved the spray. He stalked from bow to stern as if the sea were another forest and he would find the proper path if given time. Jon learned the creak of each spar, the small groans of rope under rain, the sigh the sea made at midnight when the cold was a lid on the world. Drogon came the third night. He came like night loosening itself from the sky and falling toward them with intent. The stars vanished behind him. The water crisped and danced and lifted in a million little feet of steam. Davos was awake before the shadow fell. No one had cried a warning, but men who go to sea recognize certain changes in a world's breath. And they were on the deck with hands braced on the rails when the dragon blotted the moon. He passed once, a sweep of black, then returned and hovered like a dark thought just beyond the mast's tip. If he had screamed, men would have thrown themselves flat. If he had breathed, the sea runner would have been a candle snuffed under a giant's thumb. He did neither. His eyes found Jon where he stood by the stairs, and the world narrowed to a line between two living things who had stood together beside a dead queen and understood what loss meant. "Easy," Jon said without thinking, and his voice was small and the words were nothing. Drogon drifted closer. The night wind lifted the membranes of his wings in black sails. His smell hit them, hot stone, ash, something like lightning trapped in old cedar. Ghost's fur lifted along his spine, but he did not snarl. He made a sound Jon had heard him make only once before, a low tone in the marrow of his chest. When they had come upon a grave site under a shelf of ice, and Ghost had seemed to recognize kin in the bones. "Easy," Jon said again. He put a hand to his chest and felt the egg's weight beneath his wool. He opened his coat and lifted it and held it high. Drogon's head came down like the fall of a banner after a battle. His eye was an ember. He made a noise that shook the rigging like a hand at the strings of a harp, and the harp was the world. It was not a roar. It was not anything Jon could name. He felt it in his teeth and in the little bones of his ear and in the back of his skull where the worst dreams sometimes took root. He held the egg steady. Its shell was warm, veined faintly with light like lace under skin. Drogon's breath washed him. It smelled of rain burned on iron. His tongue flicked out, the size of a battering ram softened in velvet, and touched the egg as a lover might touch a sleeping cheek. Then he lifted his head and screamed properly, a sound like a bell forged from mountain and fire, and the sea runner lurched under the weight of it. Men flung hands to ears. Old Male wept without knowing he was weeping. Drogon soared then, turned his black cut of a body eastward, and went. No one spoke for a time. The water took their shock and dissolved it. Davos laughed first, shaky and relieved. "That's a sign if I ever saw one," he said hoarsely. Jon lowered the egg. His hands were shaking. He looked at the men, at their white faces, and saw no fear that would turn to mutiny. He saw awe and a little of the old superstitious reverence that men keep even when they tell themselves they have none. He exhaled. They crossed the narrow sea on a belt of winds that made the sails sing. The free cities rose to north and south like a string of beads left by a giant across the blue. They touched at Braavos only long enough to take on water and salt meat, and for Davos to share an old drink with a man he had known in another life. The Titan watched them with a face that had never loved dragons and never would. Tyrion's tales had said there were bells in its belly that were rung when war came, but war was always coming and men grew tired of bells. The Sea Runner went on. They did not land in Pentos. They did not go ashore at Myr or at Volantis. Jon did not wish to be seen in cities that would hang his name in their markets. They skirted Valyrian waters by degrees, keeping to routes Davos said were older than the Doom. They saw a stone that had been a city once. Its towers melted like candles and then set, and they steered far around it because the water there sometimes boiled in a slow simmer and charred fish floated on their sides with their eyes white. The men whispered. Sarah Glover sang at night to keep them from hearing those whispers when they tried to sleep. Ghost learned to take the rolling of the hull as if it were the breathing of a giant friend. Jon's eggs warmed. He slept with them and without shame. He came to know their textures too precisely, one with a faint ridge, one that hummed so lightly beneath his palm that he sometimes wondered if sleep had not slipped under his skin and made him a liar. He dreamed of a city that was not a city, of columns of black fused stone, of arches that seemed to walk from place to place like herons at low tide. In the dreams, he walked with a torch. He always woke before the torch went out. The sea changed. It turned a darker blue, a heavier blue, the sort of water that looked back at you. Davos folded the map, unfolded it, and swore gently at the wind. "We're in the lanes where sailors teach their sons to lie," he said. "I'll keep us by day. By night, we'll trust the color of the foam and the stories about birds." "What stories about birds?" Talad asked, one hand on the rope, the other on the amulet his sister had given him. "A bit of glass like a tear. That they go the way men ought," Davos said. "Toward food and away from fire. Fire rose ahead at dawn after 3 more days. Not flame, precisely, but a light underwater, a faint aurora that slid like fish scales under the waves. It moved slowly." Sarah swore back at it, and Mael kissed his fingertips and touched the mast thrice. The sea runners slipped over beds that glowed for a breath and were dark again, pause and blaze, a heartbeat under the world. It was not like northern ice that sang. It was a different song entirely. "There," Davos said at noon, pointing with his chin. "Smoke." At first Jon saw only a line on the horizon that was not a cloud. It swelled as they approached, a dark band, then a bruise, then a strip of land that emitted not smoke but a vapor that had the color of smoke without its texture. The smell reached them at 3 bells. Sulfur, wet ash, something sharp. The land was not quite land. It was an assembly of bones. Islands lashed together by rock and sand and bridges that did not look as if they had been built by hands that needed answers to simple questions like how much weight they would bear. The nearest arch of fused stone shone as if oiled. Birds rested on it and then launched in jerks, as if they did not trust the rock to endure. Beyond, as if the land had been snapped by a giant and the break never set, something like a city rose out of the vapor. Silhouettes of buildings melted into other buildings, a column that might have been a tree petrified in the act of bowing. "Valyria," Davos said softly, and the men were silent. Even Sarah, who was not afraid of the sky, had nothing for this. Jon exhaled. It was not like walking into a story. It was like walking into the space the story had left behind when it moved on and forgot to take its breath with it. The wind off the land came warm and then too warm. The eggs under his coat throbbed to a rhythm not his own. "Shall we anchor in the lee?" Davos asked, and Jon nodded, because the water near the city made the sea runner twitch as if it were ticklish, and Davos hated that. They let down iron and rope with the care of men lowering a coffin into a grave that might answer. Drogon came at dusk. He came with no scream this time, as if he understood the place did not like loudness. He landed on the broken brow of a building that had once had windows like a skull, and his weight made the fused stone crack and sigh but not fall. He folded his wings, made himself smaller by an art only dragons know, and watched the sea runner with his head canted like a hound's. Jon took the smaller egg in his hands and went down into the boat. Ghost came with him because Ghost had decided the water was not going to eat him today. Davos looked at him once as if to ask if he was certain. Jon nodded, and Davos lowered them with a creaking of rope that sounded too loud in a quiet that was not quiet at all, full as it was of the hiss of vents and the whisper of steam. They went ashore where a shelf of black had formed itself into steps not meant for feet. Jon climbed them and felt heat through his boots. The air moved in convulsions near the vents, as if the land breathed with a broken lung. Drogon did not come down. He made a sound in his throat that was acknowledgement or warning. It was difficult to know with dragons, and men who said they knew were liars or dead. Jon moved across a courtyard that had once been 4 courtyards at least, fused into a single one by a fire that had forgotten its manners. He came to a square that had been a square the way a lake might be a lake after 3 earthquakes. At the center of it stood a thing like a tree. It had not been a tree when men planted it. It had been a tower of woven black glass or steel, a lattice of ribs holding up a cylinder where, once, men had perhaps studied light. Fire had taken it and melted it, and then wind had cooled it into knotted branches that twisted upon themselves in glassy loops. It rose 20 feet, 30 more. At its base, in a hollow where something had spilled and congealed. A warmth gathered that was not merely heat but a concentration of it, a hearth without wood. The egg throbbed against Jon's ribs. He went to his knees without knowing he had intended to. He set the egg at the lip of the hollow. It did not crack loudly. It did not flare with impossible light. It shivered. A hairline seam appeared, like a vein surfa. Sing. Another seam found it. Jon reached to touch the shell and then did not, because his fingers remembered fire. He watched as the seam widened with terrible slowness and then opened. A tongue of steam unfurled like a small white flag. The smell was clean somehow, fresh bread, he thought, and then thought no, older than bread, older than ovens, older than men. The thing that came out of the egg was wet and indignant. It was smaller than Jon had expected and larger than his fear. Its wings were the thinness of dreams made into muscle. It opened its mouth and produced a sound that was not yet a roar and not yet a plea but certainly a promise. Its eyes opened, slits of gold like spilled ale in a cellar torchlight. It fixed him with the furious stare of the newly born, sneezed, which was absurd, and then it made a violent, hungry movement with its neck and clamped its mouth on Jon's wrist. He did not cry out. Pain swept up his arm like a net thrown and drawn fast. He let it happen. He felt the pressure of teeth and the heat of a mouth not yet a furnace and the strange shock that traveled up his arm into his chest. An answering throb from the scar over his heart. The place a dagger had once cleared a path through his life for a hand that had not been strong enough to keep him. The dragon's mouth released him. Blood beaded in two crescents. The dragon looked surprised at the taste it had found. It regarded him with the air of a creature who had been told their food would arrive on a schedule and wanted to speak with the steward. Jon laughed once through his teeth and reached into the pouch at his belt and brought out the strip of raw fish Davos had pressed on him with a grim look. He held it up. The dragon blinked, then took the fish delicately. It chewed with an efficiency that would have pleased a captain. It made a noise that might have been approval. It crawled forward awkwardly and settled its wet, hot body against Jon's palm. The heat of it went into his bones. Above, Drogon made that throat sound again, and the shape of it was satisfaction. Or relief. Jon did not know and felt it did not matter. He reached with his other hand and touched the little creature's head in the lightest of strokes. Its eyes narrowed further. It made a sound like Cole's sighing. Ghost came nearer, head lowered, moving sidewise. He sniffed. He sneezed once in the dragon's face. The dragon sneezed back. A bargain was struck in that exchange as simple and as binding as any oath that had ever been sworn in the Godswood. Jon felt something unbend between the oldest part of the world and the part that made ships. He stayed until the second egg cracked. The second dragon came into the air quick and random, as if life had thrown it harder. It was paler than its sibling, with a tracery of silver along its ribs where the shell had pressed. It bit him too and settled too and complained too until fed. The pair of them nosed at each other and then, abruptly, fell asleep, piled upon each other like kittens of coal in the hollow's heat. Jon sat with them until his legs went numb, and he did not care. He had been cold in 1,000 ways and now found 2 small fires and would not insult the world by asking for more just yet. Night came like a lid. The land exhaled. The sea runner creaked and lifted and asked its lines if they were still tied. Drogon unfurled his wings and came down at last. He moved with impossible delicacy for a creature whose shadow could drown an army. He lowered his long head until his eye was very near the sleeping heap. He watched them with a stillness that was not possessive but priestly. Then he lifted that enormous head and met Jon's gaze. They regarded each other across a thin strip of heat for a length of time that had no bells in it. There was no forgiveness there and no condemnation. There was simply acknowledgement that 2 beings with fire in their chests had work to do. When Jon rose, his knees yelled to be consulted in future. He picked up the nearer dragon. It woke at once, irritated, and made to bite, then thought better of it because the fish had been good and perhaps fish came from hands. The second dragon was heavier and limp with sleep. He tucked both against his chest, and they complained in little squeals that sounded as if they had been stolen from mice and modified. Drogon stepped back to give him space. Ghost paced ahead and behind, trying to be everywhere at once. They made a camp within the ribs of a fallen dome, whose inside had been polished by fire into the surface of a black lake. The land there was marginally less eager to cook their bones. Davos brought water that tasted of stone but not of poison. He watched the dragons without fear. His fear had been spent years ago on other seas and for other kings. "What will you call them?" he asked, not because he thought names mattered to dragons, but because men needed names to speak of what burned them. "I will wait," Jon said. "Names come in their own time." "They do." Davos crouched by the little creatures as a man might crouch by the first fire after a long day of rain. "The old tales say the doom burned the name out of this place. Nothing holds its name long among the ruins. The sea has its own for it. The sailors keep their tongues if they never say it. The free cities, they make a title and stitch it to a banner and sell it. And yet here we are." "Here we are," Jon said, and laid the dragons down in a nest of furs and listened to their breathing settle. He slept with Ghost pressed across the door of their makeshift shelter and a coil of rope looped around his wrist and the eggshell shards in a cloth beside his head, because something in him believed you should always keep a piece of the door you came through, in case you needed to find your way back. In the morning, the city showed them more of its ruin. Not everything was melted. Pieces remained. The corner of a bath with a mosaic still somehow bright under a film of ash. A tool of black metal that had not rusted, shaped to a purpose Jon could not discern. A series of pillars that had been carved with letters that no one living would read. There were marks like paw prints where stone had once been soft and the air full of molten rain. There were bones. Not many, because fire had eaten most, but a ribcage fused into a railing. A hand preserved in obsidian that closed around nothing. The men moved quietly. Sarah swore less and in whispers. The little dragons changed as quickly as children. By noon, they fought for fish with gusto and discovered a love for squid that made them inhale tentacles with an expression of philosophical interest. By evening, they played with Ghost's tail, which Ghost suffered with dignity until he turned and barked once so loudly the smaller one fell backward. They tried to lift themselves on wings that had not yet understood air. They climbed Jon's coat as if it were a cliff that must be conquered, and then slid down in indignation when the cliff moved. They slept as if sleep were a hole in the world they fell into by accident. Drogon watched and left and returned with a pattern that made sense to him. Once he brought down a creature from a far eastern shoal that the men could not name. Big as a boat's boat, plated like a knight. He set it down with an air of patient instruction and waited while Jon and Davos hacked it apart with axes. He put one strip of the meat aside with the careful touch of a creature who knew how much was enough. When Jon offered a strip to him, he took it gently, as if to remind the man that gentleness had always been part of him and men had forgotten. On the second day, they found the stair into the tunnels. Jon did not know how to measure the city above, but the tunnels beneath were another map entirely, a second city threaded under the first. It was as if the Valyrians, having created marvels, had then hollowed the world to store the instructions. The stair ran down in a wide spiral around a central shaft. The air grew cooler. The light grew greenish. Jon carried a torch and the smaller dragon on his shoulder, who had decided height was everything. Davos followed with the other dragon clutched to his chest and a fierce look that suggested he had no intention of dying in a hole. Ghost might have refused the stair if not for Jon's hand on his scruff. He came, reluctantly, with a constant warning rumble that made pebbles shiver. They came to a hall that had not been melted. The stone there had been spared by an accident of wind. Its walls were carved in relief with scenes that made the eye ache. Men and women with hair like fire and eyes like knives. A long line of dragons as if they were a script. Between them were serpents of other shapes and things that might have been ships with wings and lamps that burned with their own guarded light. There was a table, no, not a table, Jon realized, a map the size of a small hall. It had been carved with coasts and mountains and the long-limbed bones of rivers. It was Valyria as it had been, perhaps. And in its western corner, nearly an afterthought, a narrow strip of cliff and plain that had no name here. He ran his fingers over that strip. The dragon on his shoulder hissed suddenly in excitement or in dismay. It was impossible to tell which, and perhaps unimportant. It was reacting to the ghost of something that had believed itself eternal. 7, Davos breathed. His hand skated over the map with the longing of a sailor for a coastline that tells him where he is. They built themselves into the world and expected the world to keep the bargain. Ghost's hackles lifted, then smoothed. Jon turned his head and saw why. At the far end of the hall, beyond the map, stood a row of glass candles. He knew what they were not because he had seen their like, but because he had dreamed them. Slender, black, taller than a man. They stood on pedestals shaped like coiled serpents, their wicks like faint spines. One had cracked and fallen and lay like a length of wet night along the floor. The others were whole. Jon went to them. It felt like stepping into a song sung in a language he did not know but whose tune he had always carried. He put his hand out and stopped himself twice and then did not stop the third time. His fingers brushed the cool stone. He felt nothing. He exhaled. He closed his eyes because it felt less foolish to believe in the dark. He thought of a face with hair like a raven's wing and a laugh like a knife being drawn. He thought of a boy with hands that knew winter's name. He thought of a girl on a white horse riding along the edge of a wall of ice as if she had been born for it. He thought of Sansa's voice, steady as a path. He thought of the sound a dragon had made when it touched an egg and understood it was not alone. He breathed in and out and down. The candle lit. It did not flare like torches. It breathed into light, a long, slow inhale, and then it glowed with the calm, steady patience of old fires. Jon opened his eyes and found the stone full of green. It shone the way deep moss shines under trees. The light did not flicker. It remained. Nothing else changed. The hall did not shake. The world did not tilt. Jon felt a thread. He could not name its material or its color, only that it ran from his chest into the candle and then beyond the candle into a thing that was neither here nor there. He felt very briefly that he was an acorn, and then that he was the tree that acorn might become, and then that he was the ground around it full of old leaves. Davos swore again, softly. "We will not tell the Citadel," he said, "or we will tell them and then never hear the end of it. God save me from men who think they keep all the books." Jon reached and threw his thought down the thread the way a boy throws a stone into a lake. It fell without splash. He closed his eyes and thought of the godswood and the way snow had rested upon Sansa's hair the day it crowned her. He thought, carefully, of the way her brow had creased between her eyes. He thought of that creased brow with tenderness and irritation and a brother's love that carried no weight but its own. He thought, "I am where I must be." He thought, "I will come home." He thought the words not as promises, which men broke, but as directions on a map, which men sometimes read. He felt, faintly and perhaps foolishly, a brush, like a fingertip set on the back of his hand and lifted as if to say, "Yes, I hear." He did not know if it was real and decided for once not to care. He let the candle burn until its light felt like another sound to his ears. Then he backed away. He did not feel magic. He felt usefulness, an old tool left in a shed that still did what it had been made to do. They made a camp in the hall that night, though Davos disliked sleeping under any ceiling, much less one that had weathered a doom. The little dragons chased the light of the candle as if they could catch it. Ghost slept with his head near Jon's knee and his nose pointed at the stair, as if he would scent anything that dared. Jon lay awake longer than he meant to, and in that wakefulness he heard the city. It did not talk in words. It told its own story anyway. It told of courts where men had asked fire to do more than it ought, of wells that had once sweetened slate into something drinkable, of harness still hidden in an alcove that had been meant for a parade that never came, of old rooms that had once smelled of spices that no one could name now, of a woman with her hair piled high and a ring on her hand that had been a key. It did not ask to be restored. It did not lament. Told. In the days that followed, Jon learned it. He learned where the heat gathered and where it refused. He learned the tunnels that would not collapse and the ones that would. He learned that the little dragons preferred the shade of a certain broken portico at noon, and that if he put his hand to the stone there, he felt a thrum like a slow song. He learned that Drogon loved a cliff shaped like a folded cloak and would sit there for hours, still as a statue, and then would explode upward like a storm going backward. He learned that if he lit one candle, sometimes another would light itself without his asking. He learned that light could travel along the ground, here, not as flame but as color. He learned he was not alone. The first sign was a pile of stones that moved. It had been a cairn and then was not. The stones had been set in a careful cone over what might have been bones once, and when Jon returned to that corner a day later, the cone had been a half cone, and the bones were scattered. He thought, "Fox, if foxes lived in places like this." He set the stones again because the dead asked for this in the north and it felt wrong to refuse them. The next morning they were knocked down. He set them again. The third morning, a pebble struck him on the shoulder as he bent, and he turned quickly and saw a shape dart behind a slab of black. They were not men. They were not children. They were something men would call children because men named what was small that. They wore bits of cloth and leather. They carried themselves with a secret silliness at first, as if they had not decided what limbs were best. Their eyes were large. Their ears were little shells. Their skin had a color that shifted with shade. Pale here, smoke there, a hint of ash silver when they crossed a light. They were the size of children when they first appeared and the size of taller children later, which could have been imagination too. They watched him the way birds watch people on beaches, certain that food could be extracted and also that people were slow and funny. Davos called them smoke sprites and made a horn gesture, though he did not believe in superstition. Mael sat down on the ground and offered a strip of dried fish. One took it and screamed with delight, and another bit Mael's finger, and Mael laughed because it did not break the skin and perhaps because he had always wanted to be bitten by a thing that would not kill him. The little dragons considered them with imperial aloofness until one of the sprites tied a loop of string to a broken bit of metal and whirled it like a toy. Then both dragons were lost to dignity and chased the twirling loop with the obsession of the young. Jon watched. He felt a thread he had not known he held loose in a notch. He had been afraid the city would contain only sharpness. He would have endured it if so. He would have taught his fear to walk on a leash. It pleased him. He would never say it aloud. To discover the city could also make a toy for a dragon with one hand and bite a sailor gently with the other. He kept the candle lit at night and felt, once or twice, a tickle along the thread and then a word like a leaf blowing into a room you had thought the window closed in. Alive. On the 9th day, a storm came up from the south like a tablecloth being whipped off a table set with ceramics long out of fashion. It hit the sea runner so suddenly that Davos groaned at his own foresight for not foreseeing it and then swore at the way the sea refused to listen to him. Wind shoved the world. The city did not sway. The men scrambled like seals across black stone, hammering wedges into cracks and tying lines to things that had no business being trusted. The little dragons screamed their new screams and tried to lift their bodies on wings that suddenly worked better than they had the day before, which was precisely the wrong day to discover this. Ghost dug his claws into something that had once been a fountain and now was a foot. Drogon lifted off the cloak cliff and held himself in a space above the wind that the wind did not know how to reach. He broke the storm. He did not intend to, dragons did not intend the weather, but his body made a shape the wind had to go around, and in going around it, the wind lost its bite. Rain came anyway. It came like nails, came like strings. It pinned them to the ground and then let them up and then pinned them again. It hammered. It sang a voice that was not unlike Sarah's when she swore with enthusiasm. Jon stood in it and felt the light of the candle within, that steady green, and understood the odd intimacy between fires and waters. Men like to speak as if elements warred with each other by nature. In his chest, the two found ways to braid. He thought of Sansa then as the storm rattled the city, and that night when it eased to a tantrum, he lit the candle again and sent his thought along the thread. He spoke of the dragons. He spoke of the sprites. He mentioned a map big enough to shame lords and inspire thieves. He did not say he was lonely. He did not need to. He felt again, perhaps only because he wanted to, the brush of a fingertip at the back of his hand. He woke at dawn to find the smaller dragon on his chest and the larger one on his belly, and ghost curled around all three like a promise. He lay still because to move would be to learn you had been blessed and expected to act accordingly. He lay still and let the breath of three creatures warm him and accepted that the world had chosen to keep him for another day. They began the work then. He thought of it as work because that made it bearable. He could have flown away with Drogon and the small ones, a joy and a mistake. He could have stayed and listened to the city until his hair turned white, a quiet and a failure. He chose the middle path that had always been his. He built a place for fires. He found a course through tunnels that a man could run in darkness if he had to. He made a rule with Davos about never letting the candle burn without a man to watch it. He taught the little dragons not to bite hands that fed them and to bite other things with gusto. He learned their tastes. The darker one liked eel and refused crab unless Sarah sang to it. The paler one loved crab and hated eel and would make a face that any woman in the north would have recognized from a toddler being introduced to turnips. He made flights with Drogon. The first time he climbed the great dragon's side again, he thought his heart would open and spill. Drogon lowered himself with the weary patience of a thing who knows what a task requires and resents only foolishness. Jon climbed with the caution of a man who trusted and still counted his fingers after a handshake. The heat under his legs was intense but tolerable. He settled on the ridge and fitted himself to the contours that had been a body's answer to air. He exhaled. He moved his weight the way he had once been taught to do and felt Drogon adjust in little movements that were like conversation. Then they rose. The city passed under them and was suddenly a toy. The sea spread to every edge of the world. The wind pulled at Jon's hair and then stopped when he leaned into it and said, "In his own way, I know you." Drogon moved with an economy that made Jon want to cry out for the beauty of it. He did not. He did not. He let the joy strike his chest like a hammer and did not break. They flew to the south where smoke rose from vents like cities of ghosts. They flew to the west until the sea darkened in a way Jon did not like and Drogon chose to ignore it by turning north. They flew to the east where islands made collages of themselves from black stones and white birds. They flew until Drogon had reminded wind and sky that there were still terms to be kept. On the third flight, Jon saw sails. They were bright. Yellow, blue, or red like fresh blood. They were not free city sails, not of the patterns Davos had taught him to read like scripture. They were spiky. That was the word that came to him. A child's word, true anyway. Their masts sprouted points where no mast ought. The prows were shaped into creatures with too many teeth. Some had engines, scorpion arms mounted like crowns. Men walked their decks with a certain whipcord gait Jon had learned to fear. Sell sails with nothing to do and a city behind them eager for any reason to feast. He guided Drogon down to the city again. He found Davos and pointed, and Davos's face folded its own map. "Guys," he said, and spat neatly to one side for form. Or new guys by way of old guys. They've heard a song about dragons again. That, or Volantis told them a story and they wanted to see if it was true. "Will they come ashore?" Jon asked. "Of course they will," Davos said. "If they think they can leave again." "Can they?" Davos looked at the scorpions. He looked at Drogon. He glanced at the little dragons gnawing a length of rope they ought not gnaw. "If they're wise, they'll look and go. Wisdom's thinner at sea than on land, I found." Jon felt the thread of the candle under his skin. He felt very distinctly the first old ache of a battle gathering itself. He had told himself he had come to Valyria to pay a debt and care for a fire. Men liked to come where fire was and set their own dishes at its edge. He sent a thought along the thread that said trouble and felt, perhaps, a brush again. He did not know if the brush was real. He tightened his belt. They did not go down to the shore with banners. They went to the map hall. Jon lit the candle and thought about where he wanted the guys to anchor and how he wanted the wind to slide against their masts. It was not sorcery. It was mere suggestion. The city liked a certain shape of wind. If you set your thought in the right curve, the wind might remember it. The sails came in and prowled and then found themselves drifting toward the reach of a black arm where the water seemed calm and was not. One ship glanced along a heel of stone and made a noise like a man surprised. Another backed water and nearly backed herself into an eddy that would have made her spin and spin until her men forgot how to pray. The fleet paused and took counsel of its fear. Jon breathed again. They came anyway. Of course they did. There was no city in the world that could send men so far and not demand that they put their boots on a rock and try to take a piece of it away, even if only in the shape of a story. They sent boats with men who wore armor shaped like the old ways. They came with nets and long hooks and faces set in expressions that meant to say we are not afraid, and said, in a language the body could read, please let this be simple. Jon met them not at the water's lip but at a place he had chosen, where the black stone of a plaza sloped gently into a field of hot sand. The sprites watched from pillars with their eyes wide and their fingers twitching toward rills of melted glass. Ghost stood at Jon's side, silent as a snowfall. The little dragons clung to a broken cornice above in a tangle of wings and mischief, their eyes bright. Drogon crouched on the cloak cliff and made no sound. His shadow was a city of its own. The first boat crunched at the sand's edge. The men in it hesitated because suddenly the sand seemed to have teeth. Their leader was a man with tattoos that lifted when his jaw clenched. He wore a cloak dyed red and black. He stepped out and the sand hissed. He did not look down. He walked toward Jon with the care of a man crossing a stream on stones and pretending he was in a hall. He stopped 10 paces away. In the name of guys, he said in a tongue whose syllables had learned cruelty and then learned to hide it in music, we claim. No, Jon said. The man had not expected it to be so easy. He glanced to either side as if a more elaborate ceremony might have arrived late and would correct this. I have a writ. Put it away or the wind will take it, Jon said quietly. No one here reads Giskery. The man blinked. He had expected fear of another kind. This is Valyria, he said, as if a word were a key and he had found the lock. Yes, Jon said, and that is a dragon. He did not look at Drogon when he said it. He did not need to. The guy's captain looked. His lips parted without his permission. The boat sighed. The men reached for hooks and did not raise them. And then the little dragons, obeying neither tactic nor good sense, launched themselves from the cornice and flapped down in a ragged, ecstatic glide toward the boats where strange leather smelled intriguing. No, Jon said sharply, because there are certain kinds of fight that cannot begin. The smaller dragon, curious creature, checked himself in a stutter of wings and landed ungainly on Jon's shoulder. The larger, bolder, delighted in the red cloak and flew at it. Ghost moved without sound and got under the arc of that flight and bumped him with his shoulder as if bodying a wayward lamb. The dragon spun and landed and looked indignant at his own feet. The sprites laughed, a high sound like glass beads spilling. The guy's men stared, and in their stares was calculation, fever, awe. You will leave, Jon said to the captain. The sea here is not yours. The land is not yours. I have no writ. I have dragons. You cannot keep them from us forever, the man said softly. The world will come. I know, Jon said, and felt the truth of it more easily than the sound of it. But it will not come with you, and when it comes, it will come with terms. I am making them. The captain's gaze returned to him. He studied Jon's face. He saw a scar that did not impress him. He saw a stillness that did. You are Targaryen. I am Stark, Jon said simply, and for the first time in his life he said the name as if he could set it on a table and let others eat from it. I came to keep a fire. Fires burn, the captain said, because he had read that in a book once or heard it from a priest who liked the sound of it. They can warm, Jon said. He sent his thought along the thread and felt the candle answer with its steady green. And they can warn. He lifted his hand. Drogon moved. He did not roar. He fell from the cloak cliff like an avalanche and passed over the boats at a height that pinned men to their benches as if the sky had turned to lead. The wind of his wings made the sand run in a wave. The boats teetered. The men in them understood in their meat the meaning of if they stayed, if they raised the hooks, if they loosed the scorpions. if they learned whether their courage was death or a story told later in noisy taverns. The captain's jaw moved. He lifted his chin and the writ. He lowered both. He turned his head slightly. The boats retreated. The sand sighed as if disappointed, as sand always was. They went, not in a panic but in a reassertion of pride. Their sails filled. They drew away to a distance that allowed them to pretend they were merely passing. Drogon returned to his cliff and did not preen. Jon turned and walked back across the plaza with Ghost and 2 dragons and a smattering of sprites who had decided to adopt his boots. Davos breathed out the breath he had not noticed he was holding. "They will be back," Davos said. "I know," Jon said. "So will we." He lit the candle that night and sent a thought across the sea. He did not speak of battles. He spoke of sand and laughter and the sound a dragon's wings make when they change men's minds. He thought of Sansa's hands covered in ink at a desk in Winterfell, of the way she turned the feather in her fingers when she worried at a word like a sore tooth. He thought terms. He thought roads. He thought bread. He thought a shipwright in White Harbor perhaps building a hull meant for heat. He thought, bring me iron for fletchings. Send me men who can listen to a city without deciding they understand it at once. He slept. In his sleep, he walked the tunnels and found a room where the walls had been carved with spirals upon spirals. In the center of the room, there was a shallow bowl set in the floor, and in the bowl, glass clear and unclouded. He knelt by it. He saw his face and a dragon's, and then a face with red hair that had learned never to forget anything that mattered. He woke with his hands open and an ache in his palms, as if he had been holding snow. The little dragons learned to fly in earnest the next week. They took off in botched efforts at dignity and then discovered the way lift becomes inevitability if you trust it long enough. They fell and saved themselves and fell and saved themselves until falling was no longer the word. Drogon watched with moods that would have been exasperation in any other creature and were too large in him to be named so small. He corrected with the wind. He terrified with proximity. He taught without believing he taught. Jon watched and did the smaller work. Fish and eels, steady hands. A leather hood as thin as mercy for a tender head. A ship came flying north, its cat head carved into a bull's face, Valentine by the tilt of its mast, and put up flags suggesting letters rather than writs. Jon's brow gathered. He had not thought Volantis would come so quickly. He met them again at the lip of the sand. Their envoy was an old man with a neck like a tree root and a smile that meant he had once met men with crowns and kept his own head. He bowed with a courtliness that cost him nothing and might buy everything. "We do not claim," the old man said in good trade tongue. "We inquire." "Ask," Jon said. The old man asked if dragons were possible without cities burning. Jon said yes. The old man asked if men from Volantis might cut black stone into blocks without being cut by it in return. Jon said no. The old man asked what the North wanted in exchange for something no one else could give. Jon thought for a long time while the wind pulled at his hair. He said, "Grain, iron, the promise that no slaver's ship would ever anchor within 10 leagues of any northern shore." He said, "Glassmakers sent to White Harbor, not to steal but to teach what they knew without the secrets that would cost them sleep." He said, "The names of healers who had remedies for fevers that ran through children in late spring." He said, "A text on the making of roads that did not turn to mud in the first rains of autumn." He said, "When you speak of us in your halls, say we are not savages because we prefer snow to rot." The old man smiled as if all of that pleased him. He said, "In return, if a dragon egg is found, it will be carried north." Jon said, "If a dragon egg is found, it will be left where it is until the land decides otherwise." The old man smiled again, thin as a knife. He said, "The mother of mountains has a priest who speaks of rivers of fire under the world." Jon said, "I know." The old man said, "We will write." Jon said, "We will read." That night, he did not light the candle. He lay under the broken dome and watched the little dragons sleep piled together and understood that this was how men survived. They piled together around small fires and gave their sleep to one another and showed the night they had teeth. He drifted down into the dark like a man lowering himself into a known lake. He dreamt of Winterfell. He stood under the heart tree. It had stopped pretending it did not see him and watched him openly, as if he were a boy again and had just put his handprint in the frost. Sansa stood across from him with a bundle of papers held to her chest by that peculiar grip she used when something mattered too much to be spoken of. Snow fell in a fine lace. It settled in her hair and did not melt at once. "It will be done," she said, not to him, but as if to the bones of the place that had asked for that promise and demanded he hear it spoken. "Thank you," Jon said, and meant it in the way a man means it when he has just been given not a favor but a future. In the morning, a sprite sat by the edge of the candle and dipped its finger in the wax and giggled as it pulled out a strand of green. The strand did not break. It stretched and stretched until it touched Jon's sleeve, and then it broke cleanly, leaving a smear of light on the wool that faded with a sigh. He put his hand on the sprite's head and felt its little bones and the heat of its scalp and thought, not for the first time, that the world wanted to go on. He began to plan a road. Not a road of stones to be laid from Valyria to White Harbor. No man living would waste stone on water like that, but a road of ships and terms and names. He sent Davos north with letters like seeds. He wrote with care and a terrible neatness, his hand cramping by the end. He wrote to Manderley, to Glover, to Serwyn, to Bear Island. He wrote to Lyanna Mormont and smiled, remembering the tilt of her head and the scour in her stare, and then he stopped smiling because he remembered the way her head had lain still. He wrote to White Harbor's guilds. He wrote promises he knew he could keep and none he could not. He asked for ironworkers and for their sons to be allowed to become smiths if they wished. He asked for men who did not fear heat. He asked for men who did fear it enough to respect it. He wrote to Sansa last. He did not know why he had waited. Perhaps because he had been speaking to her in the candle each night and did not wish to replace that with ink. He wrote of the sprites. He wrote of the way the little dragons slept with their mouths open and their tongues like warm peach leaves. He wrote of the map. He wrote, "I am well." He wrote, "I am yours." He wrote, "This city is a book burned and still readable." He wrote, "There will be men who want to own it. I will not let them." He wrote, "Give me time." Davos took those letters and pressed Jon's shoulder with his old hand and left aboard the Sea Runner with a crew that knew the shape of dragon shadows and would not flinch at them anymore. Jon watched the sails dwindle into the haze and felt for a moment the ache that only departures and returns could make in the ribs. He turned and found Drogon watching him, and if a dragon could look like a friend, Drogon did then. Jon bowed his head because it never hurt to be polite to gods or dragons. The days rounded. The little dragons grew into less little dragons and learned to spiral with intention. The sprites braided ropes in patterns the sailors took to sea. The candle burned, not always, not as an altar but as a lamp. Men came and were sent away. Men came and left having left something behind that was not a tooth mark. A man from Karth arrived with a box of glass that had never been sand and asked 1,000 questions and had 5 answered. A woman from Lys came with a book that contained a map of words which bent around the page in a script she said had been old when her mother's mother had first braided her hair. She cried when she saw the map in the hall because she had spent her life drawing maps and none had ever been so arrogant or so true. Jon gave her time with it and took from her a way to write terms that would hold. The guys returned a third time with more ships and more teeth at their prows. They tried to set a scorpion on a promontory that Jon's men had left free just so the guys would believe it and used. Drogon burned it, not to ash but to a heavy glass that sagged into the sea with a noise like a man who has been struck in the back while yawning. The guys shouted. The Volantines watched and wrote. The world noticed. Jon slept and woke and sometimes forgot to count his fears and found them counted anyway by hands not his own. And then, because the story wanted a seam and found one, there came a raven. It did not cross the sea by will. It came on a ship with a man who had smuggled it because he believed in messages as much as he believed in coins. It found Jon with that peculiar raven certainty, and the note it carried was short because men wrote short notes when the hand shook. It told him a thing he already knew and then another he did not. Sansa had called banners for a wolf raid along the coast where a southern lord had decided the north was only a word. She had sent men and bread and held back winter as if winter were a horse and she a girl who had learned to ride in the yard on a saddle that was too big. She had bled from a cut in her palm and not said so. She had kept her word to him and her word to the north at once. The second thing was a line. Come if you must. Bring fire if you will. I will hold. He folded the note and unfolded it and folded it again and did not know he was doing it. He realized that for a moment, a single moment, he had wanted her to ask for him in a way that would free him from choosing. He put that want down as a man puts down a cup of wine when the world is moving and his hands must be steady. He lit the candle. He sent a thought along the thread to tell her he would come and in what shape and with what cost. Drogon was already lifting his head. They flew with the morning beating at their backs. The little dragons could cross short stretches now, hopping island to island, but this run was for Drogon and a heart that had learned to be two things at once. The sea stretched beneath them like a truth men did not like. The wind found the old route in Drogon's bones and sang in it. They cut west. The free cities slipped below them like a row of toys, smoke and marble and gold and fish. The narrow sea narrowed. The air changed. Salt and pine and a stubbornness that might have been the smell of the north itself. They came upon White Harbor at dusk and did not descend. Jon knew better than to give men time to gather lines and questions. Drogon drank the sky like a throat, then arrowed inland. Snow lay over the Wolf's Wood in a clean sheet that made all the darker things brighter. Winterfell rose, not black, not white, but the color of home. The bells did not ring because there were no bells, only horns, and they blew 3 times. Once for fear, once for joy, once for a thing that is both. Drogon landed in the yard with care this time, his claws finding the old stone and testing it without breaking it. The little dragons came raggedly after on their own wings, landing with squeals and triumph. Ghost leapt from Drogon's back before the dragon had stopped moving, as if to remind everyone that wolves and fire could share a yard if properly introduced. Jon slid down and found his legs and turned. Sansa stood on the steps in a cloak the color of a deep lake in evening, her crown a band of iron and pale stone. Her hair was braided for war, for riding, for work. She looked at him and then at the dragons and then at him again. He went to one knee because his legs decided that politeness was safer than the other thing, which was to run to her. Her hand came down to his head and rested there as if on a thing she had made and had not known if it would bear weight. You came, she said, and the words were not surprise. I said I would, he said. He stood and looked at the yard where men and women he recognized in men and women. He did not stood with their mouths open and their minds racing and their hearts trying to decide if they were terrified or exalted. You are well. I am. She looked at the little dragons, who were investigating a pile of antlers with cautious aggression. They are smaller than I expected. They're larger than they were, Jon said. She smiled then, the smile of a woman who had learned to keep it for times when it would spend well. That is all any of us can ask. He bowed his head. He felt the thread thrumming brighter here, as if the candle had grown a second wick. He felt the city across the sea listening too, amused perhaps or simply patient. He felt, for a breath, that he stood in a space drawn between 2 places that had decided to trade favors for as long as men had use for bread and fire and iron. That night, he sat with Sansa by a hearth that had warmed stark bones for centuries. The hall was noisy with men speaking softly so as not to seem frightened by their own voices. Outside, the little dragons nested in the warmth of stable straw and discovered that horses did not think much of them. Drogon crouched on the eastern rampart. Like a story children would tell themselves every winter from now on whether it was true or not. Sansa listened to his words and then spoke her own, and they laid a road between them. She told him which lords had offered terms that had little to do with grain and everything to do with old slights. He told her which merchants would sell a story for the price of salt and a bed. She told him of a southern lord who had tried to levy a tax on northern ships that had never passed his harbor. He told her of a priest in Volantis who would insist that any bargain be blessed. They ate stew and drank cider and remembered, between strategy and news, that they were brother and sister, and that blood that had been asked for once now asked only for endurance. In the morning, they stood in the yard and watched the sun make icicles think themselves jewels. Sansa lifted her hand and touched one with a fingertip and caught the drop that formed there on the nail. "You will go back," she said. "Yes." He looked east. "I will come again." "You will bring books," she said, because she knew where to cut the daily cloth of work into manageable strips. "And glass," he said, "and stories that are useful, not the other kind." He smiled. "And men who can be trusted near fire." She nodded. "I will send iron and men who know how to lay a road in mud and make it stay." He reached because he could not help himself, and she let him tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. She leaned into it as if it did not cost her to do so. "Hold," he said. "Hold and build." "I will," she said. "You keep your dragon's fire from becoming a city's funeral." They parted as if they were simply going down different corridors to different works. He took to the sky with Drogon and felt the wind regard him as it had begun to do, not as a thief but as a partner. He looked back once and saw a woman with a crown the color of winter and a yard full of people learning that awe did not mean they could not mend a fence. He turned east. The city awaited him. The sprites would have stolen his boots. The candle would burn with its steady green. The map would still boast and be true. The little dragons would have learned some new foolishness to unlearn. The guys would try again and be taught again. Volantis would write. Karth would whisper. Lys would flatter. The north would send iron. A road would be built that men could not see but could walk with their hands. Fires would be kept. Names would be remembered. Terms would be taught. The world would learn to live beside a wound that had never closed and become, instead, a scar with a hearth at its center. And when winter came again and lay over the wolfswood like a hand, there would be a dragon's shadow sometimes passing under the low lid of a cloud, gliding without a cry, and the children of the north would look up from the tracks they were reading in the snow and say, "Yes, good. There is fire in the world, and it keeps the wolves warm." The wind over the bite had a different bite when you knew there was a city listening at the far end of it. Jon marked the taste of it as he crossed back over the narrow sea, Drogon settling into a long, tireless glide that made distances seem like a nuisance invented by men. He carried with him 3 new skins of ink, 2 wrapped packets of whitefish salted to Sarah Glover's standard, the only standard that existed as far as she was concerned, and a small coffer of hammered iron fittings that Manderley's best smith had made to a pattern Jon had traced on a board with a coal. He had left Sansa on the steps all iron will and lake dark cloak, and he had felt the pull of 2 lives in his ribs like the pull of 2 currents meeting and not canceling each other but agreeing to give the boat a rough passage. He had not meant, when he first saw Drogon darken the Dreadfort sky, to become a broker of terms. He had meant only to pay a debt in the currency he understood: watchfulness, steadiness, a refusal to let the worst shape everything. Yet a man standing between 2 great fires finds himself asked hourly to tell which one will cook bread and which will reduce a house to ash. He learned the answers slowly and with more missteps than he would confess to the candle. When he did confess, softly, with his palm on dragonstone glass that burned green, the hall seemed to accept his errors the way old stone accepts scuffs, and perhaps that was the best absolution men ever received. He landed again among black ribs and fused streets to find the sprites had built him a welcome of sorts. They had gathered, with inexplicable labor, a ring of shells and bits of cooled glass and twisted metal taken from vents when they were sleepy, and they had set the ring at the entrance to the map hall. It looked like a child's crown and a trap sprung for a crow at once. One of them, bolder or merely hungry, presented a string knotted in alternating patterns. 2 tight, 1 loose, 2 tight. Jon crouched and let it loop around his wrist. The little dragon with a taste for eel nosed the string and snapped at it, then remembered he had once been chastised for such and tucked his head sideways in an attempt at dignity that only made the sprites squeal with delight. Drogon, from the cloak cliff, lowered his head and huffed once, stirring the ring of treasures into a brief clatter, as if to say, "Very well then, this is a ritual now." Davos was not due back yet. That left Jon the space of several days to pretend the work would be simple. He began with rope. The rope he had asked of Manderley's men was not ordinary rope. It had a core of wire twisted within it, and leather wraps at intervals where hands might grip without slicing themselves open. He set 3 coils of it under the map hall's western arch and 2 under the broken portico where the small dragons liked the noon shade. He taught the sprites a game that involved looping, hauling, and releasing to account, and in exchange EY taught him a speaking of whistles that meant up, down, danger, eat, shiny, and John, which was a flat little tone he had never heard used with his name before and which he recognized, ruefully, as the sound creatures make for a being who can be trusted to fill their bowl. He taught the sailors who had stayed, the Talad brothers, Sarah, male without age, how to run lines from a high spar on the Sea Runner's foremast up to a hook he had set in a fused spur of rock. If a boat needed to kiss the stone fast and be away faster, it could do so. If a man fell, hands above could haul him into air that would not kill him. If a scorpion tried for a bite at a dragon wing, a rope could carry a pot of oil up to a lip where a sprite could do a small, decisive mischief. The small dragons learned to chase a knot of rags on a cord until the cord snapped and to bring the knot back instead of tearing it to threads. They rarely did the second, but each time they remembered, John praised them as if they had toppled a tower with cleverness alone. Praise made them preen and try again. Ghost watched all of this with a gaze that suggested wolves had never required a rope to be steady and never would, but he accepted that some creatures were born with too much sky in them and needed the comfort of lines. In the tunnels, John made another road. He chalked a narrow mark at shoulder height along a path that did not pass too near vents when they were angry, that did not run beneath ceilings spider-webbed with stress, that skirted a gallery of old iron as if iron could still wake and seize a man's ankle out of meanness. He taught the men the path until they could run it blind with a hand out, touching chalk at each turning. He taught the sprites not to rub the chalk away out of curiosity or out of the untidy passion for smearing that possessed them when they were done with a food. He kept the candle burning when they ran the chalk course at speed. He told himself he did this to persuade his fear to sit quietly in a corner while he worked, but some part of him also believed that the light itself made men quicker at the edges of their sight, as if awareness were a substance the green poured into them. The guys appeared again in his sky on the 4th day. They came in 2 files of 6 with oars biting and sails merely for show. Their prows were horned. Their decks looked bristled with legs. The scorpions were lashed without covers, naked in their arrogance. They anchored farther out than before, as if the last lesson had taught them modesty, then launched boats like teeth spitting seeds. Their colors were new. Faded purple and stripy red with a black thread through the weave he did not recognize. An embroidery of ambition. John watched them from the cloak cliff with Drogon a shadow that overlapped his own. "Hold!" he said aloud to no one and everyone. He meant the sprites under orders to stay on pillars, meant the sailors whose hands went naturally to blades, meant himself. This time the guys brought a woman. She was younger than John, and her face ate the distance between them in a way faces sometimes do. She wore a collar that was not a slave's collar and yet was gold interlinked scales in a flexible sheet, a piece of power that glanced off sunlight and sent it back meaner. She walked with a spear in her hand but held as a staff. She stopped a measured space away and glanced once at Drogon, once at the smaller dragons, and once at Ghost. None of those glances were lingering. She had come to look a man in the face and decide whether he was a lever or a wall. "We come to speak," she said in a tongue made tame for trade. Her own language scraped in the shape of her consonants. "Not to claim." "Speak," John said. "You are not of Volantis. No, you are not of Pentos or of Karth or of Lys." Her eyes slid, just for a breath, toward the sprites and did not otherwise betray curiosity. "You are not of Guys," she added with a little curl to the word that put teeth back into it. "I am of the north," John said. "It lies beyond the sea and beyond the next and beyond men who imagine maps are narrow." "Then you are alone," the woman said, not as insult but as assessment. "Alone people do not hold ground against cities. They bargain." She lifted her chin by a fraction. "I am Darzapal. I speak for Ulthas the younger, triarch in all but name." There was a little shine in her eye when she said the title, as if she knew it was stolen and liked the taste of theft. "John," he said, knowing names given simply sometimes disarmed more than titles. "You may speak, Darza." She gestured to the fused stones around them, the black curves and the collapsed arch like a ribcage pinned with spears of light. "This is a wound," she said. "You see it that way, so do we. Wounds become scars when hands tend them. We have hands. We have men who know how to take glass that will not break and turn it to a wall that will not fall. We have a hunger to make old things bow. We will give you coin for the right to carry away what can be carried, and we will leave men to help you hold what cannot, and we will provide oars to ship your iron and your grain. We will write that we are partners." She smiled with a precise generosity. "You may even sign first." No one had taught John to sit at tables where men offered him parchment and expected him to trip on the words. He had learned on walls, in dirt, at gates where the hinges moaned, and in halls where the air had carried the breath of dead kings. He liked to think it made him harder to trick and easier to fool in equal parts. He looked at her spear hand. There was a ridge of scar at the palm, a thickening at the thumb from long practice, and a single bad break in childhood, poorly set. He looked at her boots. Their soles were new. She had changed them for the shore. He looked at the men behind her. They were lean, their eyes thirsty, their hands eager. He looked at the scorpions lashed in the boats, the sea. Ruse stroking their firing arms as if those arms soothed anxious fingers the way prayer beads did priests. "No," he said. "Do you think you can keep this, North?" Darza asked, for the first time putting a little heat in the word that named him. "Yes," John said, "because I am not alone." She frowned a fraction, not because she believed him, but because he had contradicted a premise and she had not decided yet if it mattered. He lifted his gaze past her and let it rest on the Sea Runner's mast, on Sarah's head bent over a coil of rope, on the place where the sprites had gathered a ring around the candle with bits of green rock that glowed faintly at dusk. He let it rest on Drogon's calm, immense bulk. "You will go," John said evenly, "and you will tell Ulthas the Younger there are men on the far side of the world who think farther than he does. You will tell him if he tries to set a stone here without asking first, the wind will find a way to pull that stone loose. You will tell him that the next time his men try to set claws on this shore, they should wear leather that does not squeal when it burns. And you will tell him if he sends men in chains, I will cut the chains and measure lengths of rope for his priests. It would have been better, perhaps, diplomacy and all its tedious theater considered, to sweeten somewhere." He could not make the word sweet without lying to his own mouth. Darza looked at him long. He could see in her face the scale she kept in her mind, placing on one side his insolence and on the other the shadow that had not moved since she stepped onto the sand. Behind her, a man shifted. Drogon uncurled the tip of his tail and brushed it against the stone. The sound was a whisper. The man's face went still. "You keep a wound," Darza said at last, "as if it were a nurse keeps a babe. That is a strange work for a man." "It is good work," John said. "Will you go?" "You will bleed," she promised. "I know," he said, and did not look at the scars under his shirt to confirm it. She nodded once, a small bow. She signaled. The men pushed the boats backward into the little chop and took their seats and went. The scorpion's armatures creaked in a dozen tiny groans like a choir that had forgotten the words. John did not move until the boats were halfway back. He lifted a hand. No signal, only emotion. Drogon left the cliff, passed low and slow over the water without a roar, and set the boats pitching in a rhythm that told them what drowning felt like and then let them sit upright again. John watched the oars dig in with a new fervor. "She'll be back," Sarah said at his shoulder, because Sarah had developed a knack for appearing exactly when a thing had been decided and needed saying aloud. "She will," John said. "So will others." "Good," Sarah said fiercely. "I like reminding men they're not the only teeth in the world." When Davos came back, he came with letters sealed in wax that felt absurdly ceremonial in this place where heat made wax tremble and go soft at the edges. He came with men from White Harbor bent to carry crates of iron and windlasses, and with them a boy with his hair shaved in a strip down the middle, an apprentice of the Glass Guild who believed he had come to a place that would inform the rest of his life and didn't mind that the information would include fear. He came with a woman from the Barrowlands who called herself an herb wife, though the men in her village called her, which because names were always a weapon in someone's hand. Her name was Rice. She had the look of willow bark and the mouth of a person who had seen men's lungs swell and burst with wet and made soups anyway. She nodded at the candle and said, "That does no harm by itself," which was the best blessing John had heard in weeks. Davos was tired. He settled himself against the base of the map and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. "Your sister has the north eating from her palm, and never once does she give them cause to think their teeth need to find her skin," he said with admiration that had something like awe in it. "It is a talent. She has your patience and none of your habit of putting yourself in front of a spear because you think the spear's feelings will be hurt if you don't." John half smiled. "She told me to bring books." "She will get them," Davos said, rummaging and producing, like a magician who preferred ragged cloth to silk, a wrapped packet of pages bound with twine. Plans for culverts from White Harbor's best, with drawings so clear even men who never built anything but lies could put 2 stones together from them. 3 treatises from a maester who's decided he likes your letters and not the name attached to them. "Don't make a face, lad. He never asked for your parentage and I didn't tell him." And a list of oaths sworn at the Merman's court regarding slaver hulls. They're bound to a teller's staff now. If a slaver's oars cut northern water, he denies his god too, and that will make his tongue sting. "Good," John said, and Davos added, producing a little wooden box with a look that was part delight, part skepticism. "Stained glass samples from a guild hoping to build you something. Saints and swords, that sort of nonsense, if only they had a pattern. I told them there are only 2 saints here, patience and rope, and they didn't laugh." "They wouldn't," Sarah muttered. "Volantis wrote," Davos continued. "Their letter was polite where the guys would never manage. They propose a joint council to agree upon what no one agrees upon yet. They offer scriptures in a tongue no one here will speak. They promise a hall of welcome if you need it for a winter in their city. They ask for a guarantee you will not feed a dragon within 3 boat lengths of a Volantine hull, which tells me their captains have seen your little ones eat a crab and gone pale at the vigor of it. "I will not feed a dragon within 3 boat lengths of anything that floats," John said with a severity that made Sarah snort. "They are ungraceful when they are merry. They're merry often," Mael observed from the hall's entry, watching one of the dragons with crab paste on its snout make a dignified attempt to lick its own face. "Guys will push," Davos said, the mirth flattening. "They're moved by hunger and by a pride that's been gnawed raw. I spoke with a man who had been in New Guise's court, a shipfactor with a tongue that liked to wag. He said the younger Triarch means to write his name on a map where the old one burned. He was drunk when he said it, which means he'd said it sober too." John nodded. Opportunity made men childish. Flame made them older than their bones could bear. He had to walk these 2 truths until they made a road between them. "We will set teeth on the shore," he said quietly. "Not to bite, but to make men keep their feet." The teeth were towers. There were stubs of old balustrades and things that had once been footings but were now just suggestions set into fused stone. John and the sailors and the sprites and the boy with the shaved strip in his hair set iron teeth into those. They hammered lead around them and used wedges where lead balked and jute rope where wedges groaned. They raised frames that would hold not banners but bells. Not bells of war, warning bells, storm bells, bells of tide and wind. The sound of them would be the sound of a city choosing itself each day. When the first bell lifted into a bracket and sat there stunned at its altitude, the sprites capered and tried immediately to pour melted green into its mouth. Sarah shooed them away and then let one sprinkle a dusting in after all, for luck, because even sensible women recognized the value of a well-placed charm. They built beacons too, not pyres. No man lit piles of wood here for any reason. They built long scoops like the palms of giant hands and lined them with a black glass the boy from White Harbor had brought and a polish the guild kept in a pouch like snuff. They set the scoops to face the wind that usually came when ships liked to risk their luck. They filled the scoops with a thin layer of whale oil saved in jars as if it were a saint's hair. They placed a wick in each that any sprite could pull and any sailor could catch with a flint. When lit, the scoop did not burn noisy. It made a long, low light like a shawl thrown across the eyes of the sea. You could not steer a fleet by it. You could decide, looking at it, that night would not eat you. The small dragons approved of the beacons. They warmed their bellies in the glow and gave the light their little ballooning huffs as if giving it back. They learned better to hover above the scoops without setting the oil flaring. They learned restraint in the way any creature learns it who has discovered it can end a thing by mistake and prefers it to continue. John did not fool himself that they would always prefer. He did not fool himself that he would not fail at teaching, just as he knew he would not always succeed at diplomacy. He tried anyway. He found himself growing more patient, not because patience was virtuous, but because he had watched impatient men turn good roads into bogs. Trade arrived, not in a flood and not always with flags. Cautious captains pushed their prows into water that had a reputation for eating iron and found rope lines to catch in voices that did not sneer at ignorance. They found men who did not barter desperately or arrogantly, who asked for iron and grain and glass skill and offered hides and salt fish and bolts of heavy cloth spun in places where snow never fell. They brought clay jars filled with sticky syrup sworn to cure everything and actually only soothing coughs, which was something. They brought spices that made the sprites sneeze until they fell off their pillars laughing. They brought to John's hand, once, a small old blade of a peculiar steel, wavy and darker than northern iron, a piece of somebody's inheritance found wedged under a collapsed stair. The man who brought it wept when he set it down because he had dreamed of Valyria as a child in a room where the wall let in wind, and now he had touched it and given it away for the price of wine and a story he would tell until his teeth fell out. John bought things. He bought a dozen simple lenses from a Volantine factor who carried them wrapped in lamb's wool as if they were babies. He bought pine tar by the barrel. He bought a sack of seed a man swore grew a plant that liked to eat salt out of the ground. He bought books when anyone dared. He paid for things fairly. He refused to pay for men. Darzapal returned once with fewer boats and more people with eyes. She did not try to land and was wise to that degree. She watched from a distance while the beacons were lit against a sudden fog that rose from the vents like a city of guests uninvited. She watched the sprites haul a rope in a precise pull and rest that had to have been taught. She watched Drogon drift above it all, quiet as a thought, vast as a proclamation. When she left a flag staked on the farthest spur of safe sand. It had a design on it that meant a thing in her city and meant nothing here. John let it hang. The sprites gnawed a corner and found it unappetizing. When winter pried the narrow seas lid down, John did not cross. He sent Davos and mail and the Talids with dispatches and tricks of lens and bundles of drawings wrapped in oiled leather thick enough to turn rain. He wrote by candle and by hearth and by the green when it would take him, and into his letters to Sansa he poured not love. He did not trust that word to stay clean in a world like this, but loyalty so dense it would have sunk like metal if he'd pushed it into water. She wrote in return of roads that stayed mud only 1 week in 3 now, of watchfires kept and shifts set, of a girl who had come to Winterfell wearing a southern cloak and the haunted look of someone who had told the truth in the row. In room for too long. She wrote of a woman in White Harbor who had taken the stained glass and set saints in it anyway, but saints without faces, so that any Northman looking might see his own mother in the color if he wanted, and any Free Cities woman might see her own aunt. Sansa wrote of rumor too. The citadel had begun to whisper, cautious as men in a library at night. A maester in Old Town had had a student who had seen a captain who had lost a scorpion arm to glass that melted. That maester had written a paper called On the Persistence of Fables in the Minds of Those Who Should Know Better. Another had written a rebuttal called On the Utility of Fables When Men Must Live Beside Them. A lord in the Reach had begun to plan a hunt for dragon horn, something that had been a sound in a story and might be a sound in the world again if men were foolish. The Iron Bank sent a question, not a threat, inquiring if the North's new trade precluded old debts. Sansa sent back a list of repayments and a small gift, a thing a Manderley glassman had blown in the shape of a coin chest that could hold only a gull's egg. The Iron Bank smiled without moving and recalculated. A winter storm came up from the west with a grudge and a long memory, and Jon learned what Valyria did when a wind not born in its vents shoved at it. The city bent where it could and cut the wind where bending would break stone. The beacons sang with flame. The bells spoke in a rhythm that steadied hands and made men think they might walk to morning. The small dragons tried to fight the storm and were sent indoors by Ghost, who had no patience for children who thought they were taller than weather. Drogon rode the storm because there was no other word for it, finding places where the wind's bones could be leaned on and other places where he could not. He taught the storm his outline. The storm did not care. It devoured iron and rope and sent a boat onto a shelf of stone that had looked harmless in noon light. They saved 6 of the 9 men on that boat. They could not save the 7th because a wave took him and turned him 3 times and fed him to a place in the sea that kept its teeth shut. They could not save the 8th because he had gone under once already and the cold had wrapped him and would not unclench. The 9th they lost because he reached for a glass box he had kept under his shirt on a leather thong, a box that had been his charm since he was a child, a box his mother had given him. He reached and the new wave took him. Jon stood on the black shelf with rope cutting his palms and hate in his mouth for a world that asked men to choose wisely when the only wisdom was to refuse to be born into such choices. He listened to the bell's steady shape. He saw the candle's steady breath. He did not forgive the sea. He promised himself he would ask it again for mercy the next time it tried to take a man who had bought bread for his sister. After the storm, the city smelled of lightning and iron and ash washed clean. The sprites slept piled like puppies in a gallery with a mosaic floor of small fishes who were green and blue and white and not one like any fish that swam now. The small dragons were silent, chastened by the part of the wind they had not comprehended, and sat with their heads under their wings as if shelter could be built from oneself. Drogon lay on the cloak cliff with his left wing outstretched and a line of new tears in the membrane. Jon and Rice worked oil into the ragged edges and bound them with linen the herbwife had steeped in something that smelled of apple peel and tin. Drogon endured their fussing with a long-suffering dignity that insisted he had always planned to allow this. "Do you think they dream?" Rice asked, looking at the large eye that held her as reflection and not as meat. "Of us, I mean, not of each other or of Sky." "Yes," Jon said without hesitation. "What do they dream of us? That we are and that we keep. That we will not suddenly stop being. That's all any child asks of a mother," Rice said. "The world does not always see them as children," Jon said, thinking of Darza and Ulthas and any number of men who would stand on a deck and see only teeth. "No," Rice said, "but you don't have to be the world." She wrung the linen with hands that had set bones and spooned soft gruel into broken mouths. "You can be yourself, and that is not nothing." That winter they built a wall along the outermost verge where water loved to lick and then bite. Not a high wall. No high wall stood long here, but a low breakwater of chunks of fused stone and iron scrap and cunning ropes netted through like tendons. It changed the sea's conversation. The water did not pound straight. It slurred and spread and came at them tired. Men began to trust the edge of the plaza again. Trade tongues grew less hoarse with the sound of fear. Drogon healed. The small dragons put on another handspan of wing and learned to sleep with one eye open in the manner of creatures who are born under birds that would gladly pluck them from the air. The sprites discovered a pocket of crystal under a cracked stair, and when the sailors held those crystals up to the candle, the green poured through with a mildness that made men feel briefly as if they had been given a second try at some old mistake. Rice boiled the crystal in water and made a tea that eased coughs. She wrote a brittle recipe for Sansa, who sent it on to a woman in Torrens Square and to another in the hills above Last Hearth, and men who had suffered the long winter's rasp found a watery affection in their throats when they swallowed it. Darza came once more, not with boats this time, but with a single swift hull and a flag knotted at the end of its staff in a morning fold. She asked to come ashore. Jon allowed her to, because sometimes letting a threat step close makes it decide that claws are too crude. She carried a box the size of a man's skull, bound in bronze with a hinge shaped like a snake that had eaten its tail and was not yet certain it wished to stop. She set it on the black and did not open it. "Our triarch sends this to sit in your hall," she said. and for the first time her voice held something other than calculation. The fold of her flag made the strange sadness in it make a kind of sense. He says it is a token that men have, at least once, managed to pass a thing between them without cracking it. What is it? Jon asked. Darza smiled a little, the corner of her mouth moving as if it had not had much practice. I do not know. It was found under a house in a district that burned and then did not. The old woman who lived there had kept it because her mother had, and now she is tired and wishes to die without taking everything with her. The Triarch bought it with coin and with a promise about her grandson. If you break your promise about slavers near northern shores, Ulthas says he will break hers about the boy. She let the threat hang too deliberately for it to be anything but habit. Jon nodded. You may open it, he said. No, Darza said. It ceases to be gift when giver opens it. She touched the snake with one finger. If you cannot bear a mystery closed, then perhaps you should not bear it open. She glanced at Drogon with a flicker that was not fear. There is rumor you lit a glass candle. Jon did not confirm. He did not deny. He kept his face still because men made a meal of your expressions when you did not. Darza watched him watching her. She left. The box remained. Jon did not open it. A raven from Winterfell came with a scrap of news disguised as trivia. A singer at the last hearth had composed a lay called The Queen's Bread that had grown like a good story does, changing one note at a time until a woman in Barrowton sang it to her child as The Queen's Hands. And in White Harbor, a man with a fish knife hummed The Queen's Roads without noticing. Sansa's letters had grown shorter and more pointed, a sure sign she had too much to do and had chosen, as always, to do it in order of greatest loneliness. She asked questions he could answer and did not ask questions he could not. He wanted, sometimes, to send her back metaphors, how the wind in Valyria slid like a knife behind broken arches, how the sprite's little feet kept time with bells, but he sent instead lengths of clear instruction. He knew what she wanted from him and what he wanted from her. The kind of help that did not stab a man's pride as it steadied his hand. When the sea's lid lifted for spring, Jon crossed again. He took with him the small dragons because they had howled until even Ghost had looked to him with a stare that said perhaps it was kinder to set fire to the ship and go nowhere than to risk this whaling. He built for them a shelter of stretched leather at the Sea Runner's stern and made for each a little hood that they hated and wore anyway. They ate poorly for 3 days and then discovered they could watch the roll of waves and bear it by spitting at the crests. They spat and fell asleep exhausted and woke to spit again. The sailors found this hilarious until the eel-loving one misjudged and landed a gobbet on Mael's boot. Mael pretended to be enraged, and the sprites, who had smuggled themselves aboard by clinging to ropes and pretending to be knots, provided a chorus of whistles that meant shame and then meant not really, we like you. Jon landed at White Harbor with a sense of both urgency and homecoming and found the city changed again. It breathed easier. It walked like a man who has found out a tooth that haunted his sleep can be pulled with less pain than fear promised. He saw new frames rising along the dockside, trestles for drying nets, and beyond that, a low, long building with walls thick and tight. Sansa's grain warehouse, he guessed, built from stone and wits. Men called him Lord, and the children called him Dragon, and he was neither and both and something else at once. He ate a fish stew in a tavern with no sign over the door. Its name was simply the smell, and listened to a dockman explain the politics of rope in a way that told Jon more about the city than any Lord's Council could. He rode to Winterfell with Ghost loping happy over old ground. He did not fly because the little dragon's wings needed rest and because he found, lately, that walking the world made him richer for it. He watched crows on a fence post consider him and decide he was not worth a gossip today. He passed a man fixing a wheel in a rut and saw another come up behind with a brace and a tool he had not seen before, a shape of Sansa's new road's knowledge, and the two men worked without speaking much, trading weight and effort with an intimacy usually reserved for brothers. The Godswood was as it had been every winter of his life and every winter before, the heart tree red and white and old as obligation. Sansa met him wearing a plain dress the color of nettles and a shawl knit thick, her crown on the table, ink on her fingers. She did not rise. She finished the line she was writing, set the feather aside, blotted the line with sand, and only then lifted her eyes. The look they gave each other contained a feast's worth of words neither would spend when bread was dear. He set the little dragons to a basket of warm sand near the hearth. They loved it, sighed, and went instantly to sleep, one paw on the other's head. "You opened it?" she asked, surprising him. "The box." He shook his head. "No, I did," she said. She lifted her chin at his start. "Not that one," she added, amused. "Another one in the winter town found under a house that has stood since before the fall of the wolf's den. Old wood, dry as gossip. Inside was a sheaf of notes in a hand I recognized from a maester whose master taught him and mine stole from both. Instructions for winterproofing a wheel hub. They will have broken axles. I opened it because a woman from the hands market brought it and said she wanted me to see the inside of her life, and I told her I looked at what men brought me and also at what they did not. She laughed and said, 'Then look,' and I did." "You disarmed her with the truth," Jon said. "I suspect that is your role," Sansa said. "I trick men with it." They spoke until dawn in little rains, short bursts of news, heavy only in the ways that had weight to them. He told her of Darza and the guys and the snake-hinged box unopened. She told him of a lord in the south who had written to ask for a road north of Moat Cailin so he could sell his apples. She had said yes and sent him a condition, that he build an inn and keep its beds clean and its beer honest. He had written back in offense at the implication that his beer was not honest. She smiled when she told it, ever so slightly. He told her of the bells of Valyria. She told him of a bell maker in White Harbor whose father had died at sea. The man had begun to tune bells to the sound of his father's laugh, and now the whole city chimed in that key. Jon laughed then, properly, a sound that startled him even as it warmed him. She watched him make it as if she were counting breaths. Arya came with the third day. She did not enter. She let herself be seen from the yard like a fox at the edge of a wood, their eyes crossing the space like a bridge they had built as children and still trusted. She looked thinner and taller and more like a person who dwelt in motion than in halls. "I have seen land beyond where maps stop pretending they know," she told him later by the stables. Hands busy with a bridle she had no horse for at that moment. "It is not empty. That should comfort men or frighten them. I don't know which yet." "Be frightened a little," Jon said. "It keeps the heart honest." "Be comforted a little," she shot back. "It keeps the heart kind." She touched one of the small dragons and jerked her hand back as if she had been stung, then laughed because the dragon had only sneezed on her. "You always find the strangest beasts to keep," she said. "They find me," he said, and meant her too. Before he left, Sansa walked with him along the outer wall where snow had collected in drifts shaped like sleeping sheep. "There will be trouble from Old Town," she said without adornment. "Not because they mean me ill in particular, but because men who insist they keep all candles will not abide someone lighting a green one elsewhere. A maester has written me that he will come to study in my court. He will insist. He will be polite. He will put questions in the air like gnats. Let him," Jon said. "Give him a bed, and let him itch." "You will not bring a candle," she said, and made no question of it. "Not to Winterfell. No, I would not ask. I ask men to stand and to work and to tell me when they have broken a thing that belongs to another. I do not ask them to carry fire into rooms where people are sleeping." He drew breath to say she could ask anything. He closed it because the truer thing was better. She already did, and he was grateful for the fact that her asks came wrapped in cloth men could carry without burning their hands. He went east again with more names to lay on water. He found the box Darza had left exactly where he had set it in the map hall, undisturbed. He lifted it once and knew it had weight worthy of its size. He turned it and listened. Nothing. He set it down again and told himself a story about patience that did not include pride. There would be a day for lifting the snake's head and seeing what writhed beneath. He had learned that opening a thing at the wrong time was only a more elegant form of breaking it. Althas the Younger put pride into a fleet in late summer and sent it like a knife. He had learned from Darza enough to keep his scorpions low, and to go around the cloak cliff's shadow, and to loose fireships after men at rope lines had work enough already. He thought for 3 moves and did not think for the 4th. Drogon fell on his van and made the neat lines a mess. The beacons burned a path that turned 2 fireships aside. The sprites cut lines men were counting on with their quick teeth. The small dragons did no great work except to be themselves, flaring and swooping and distracting like pennants with malice. The Sea Runner took a bolt in her flank and did not founder because Sarah had taught her to leak like a sieve and not a bucket. In the end, the Giscari broke not because they were cowards, but because the sea does not care if a man thinks himself clever, and Darza, who had not boarded a ship that day, pulled the rest away with a hand that did not tremble until the anchor was down again and no one saw. Jon stood on black stone after and counted the living and the dead. He washed blood from the map's edge where it had splashed in a ragged crescent. He lit the candle and did not pray because praying never felt right on his tongue. He set his thought to Sansa like a beam laid from one house to another across a gap. He told her the cost. He told her the keeping. He told her the names of 3 men with no family who would find coin at Winterfell if they came before the end of autumn, and said, softly, to a girl with a linen cap, "I come for the bread of the Queen's hands." He bent his head until the green light painted his hair and refused to cry because the world did not care for his tears, and he was too old to spend water on wounds that were cleaning themselves. He opened the snake-hinged box the day after the fight, not from greed for reward, from the understanding that something given sealed in mourning deserved the chance to speak when the room had been swept. He did it alone for no better reason than that solitude made his mistakes his own. He flicked the hinge up with a thumbnail and felt resistance like wet leather, and then a small, private click, as if a throat that had been closed had opened again to air. Inside lay glass, not a candle, not a blade, not any cunning tool he could name. Flat sheets of smoked black, stacked like thin bread, each no thicker than the breadth of a fingernail. He lifted one. It caught the light and did not return it, only softened it, and as he tilted it, the green from the candle gathered in it and swam. He thought of water under ice. He thought of eyes. He thought of a boy who had watched for things in the dark and had learned to name what came by breath and weight and not by sight. He set the sheet against the map. The continents took on a different shape, not to the eye, but to the hand that traced the coast. The glass magnified, not the whole, nothing so simple, but a bit, a curve. He could see in a new delicacy the suggestion of sound in the way a shore met the drawn sea. It was as if the Valyrians had made lenses not for light but for the feeling of a thing under a finger. He drew his hand along the edges of Valyria's own coasts and felt a small bump where the carver had corrected himself and smoothed and left a ghost of his mistake. He slid the sheet to the west, to the thin knife of land that men of the free cities called Westeros, as if naming a thing made it theirs, and he laid the glass over the neck where the north held on. He felt with finger pads a faint cracking in the stone that had been in the stone all along. He felt how men go where they were meant to build bridges and where they had tried and failed. He understood then what the thing was. He smiled without meaning to. He laughed, the private sound that lives between a grunt and a sigh. He set the sheet aside gently, lifted its fellow, and then another. There were 9. He took them outside and set one against the edge of a vent in the late afternoon light. The sprite that loved knots climbed his arm and tried to lick it, and then tasted tongue and made a face that suggested the glass had not been meant for mouths. At dusk, when the beacons took flame as if the green candle had kissed each of them, Jon set his thought along the thread again and sent Sansa the feeling of a shore cupped in a hand made sharp by glass. She answered, he thought, not in words, but with the sense of a woman standing at a table in a keep with smoke in its stone and choosing precisely where to put a bridge and where to put a ferry and where to put a waiting place with a roof. He felt absurdly and perfectly that in that moment the road they were making had a palmer's badge, glass and rope and iron, pinned to its shirt. When autumn came down like an agreement, the small dragons had learned to lift a man on a rope between them without twisting him into a knot. They had learned to stoop at a cloth thrown in the air and catch it without biting the hand that wore it. They had learned that a tether around a foreleg was not a humiliation but a grace that saved life in wind's mischief. Drogon had decided that the cloak cliff was no longer sufficient for his vanity and had taken to a higher perch that had once been the top of a column and was now a tooth. He preened there in sun that loved his black and would not let go. He tolerated the attentions of Rice, who had begun to read to him without expecting understanding, as if his body enjoyed the sound and would, by and by, attach meaning to it the way a child does to a word he has heard spoken in 15 different tempers. Guise sent a delegation with olive branches carved of bone. Volantis sent one with scrolls heavy with ink. Karth sent a man painted in powder who wore a cloth over his mouth as if he were keeping secrets in and they would dirty the day if they got out. Jon received them under the broken portico, and to each he offered a seat that was not a seat but a stone, a drink that was not wine but a tea that had never known a vine, and a view of ropes, bells, and beacons. Darza came to that meeting uninvited and stood at the edge like a knife laid near a man's plate at the wrong angle. The Volantines stiffened because Volantis had histories with knives. The Carthines smiled as if painted amusement were a net pulled softly over prey. Jon made no scene. He gestured to a stone. Darza took it with the poise of a woman who had sat in rooms men thought only they knew how to fill. "We will not claim," Jon said, "because it needed saying once to begin. No city will. The wound is tended. The fire is kept. We will trade." They spoke for 4 hours and then 2, and then another half as the sun moved along and Drogon deigned to move with it to keep his shadow from swallowing the table. They argued about words, which mattered and did not, and about lines, which mattered more on maps than in tides. Jon said no to any clause that included the word share when it named the city itself. He said yes to words that named roads and men and bread. He cut from the Carthene a suggestion that the small dragons be exhibited on certain days for a fee with a look that promised new pepper in his tea if they pressed. He let Darza have the word steward in a paragraph about Giscari laborers whose hands knew how to move heavy things without starting quarrels with the ground. He let Volantis inscribe an article which bound men to drop casks of certain oils in certain nets at certain tides as if they commanded the sea. Men liked to think they did. He did not mind their arrogance when it cost him nothing and taught him where their ears lived. At evening, when they rose and their mouths were dry and their tempers at that particular calm which follows a quarrel that will continue politely, Darza said, in the tone of a woman asking a question for herself, "Do you never tire?" "Yes," Jon said. "I sleep." She looked toward the candle hall, which had been lit at dawn and now slept itself to a paler green, the wick's eye narrowing as if watching men. "And when you sleep," she said, "does the city stop?" "No," Jon said. "It has been here longer than my rest and will be here long after. It can carry my sleeping." She nodded, and the small, lest smile touched the corner of her mouth again, as if she had discovered a secret that did not require spilling. "We will not come with chains," she said softly, not a promise but an intention, which sometimes in the world was worth more. "Good," Jon said. "Bring bread." Winter tasted first along the edges of the wolf's wood in his sister's letters when she stopped telling him the names of every lord's smallest grievance and began listing barley yields and the disbursement of peat. He sent back measures for cutting peat so that the bog would heal, learned from the herbwife and from a sprite who had discovered by accident what men's boots obscured. He wrote to Manderley for hulls wider in the belly and lower in the water. He wrote to Bear Island for a carpenter who could build a spar with a notch cut for rope that had a wire in it. He wrote to Arya without expecting answer, describing a bird he had seen above a vent with feathers that had become like scale and noting, without saying it was a warning, that there are places in the world which change what touches them, and that to walk where they have been is to risk becoming different without seeing how until you find your shadow heavy. Once, in the small hours, he woke with a sound in his ear that was not the sea or the wind or a dragon's breath. He sat up. Ghost stepped from the doorway with the dignity of a creature who has never taken a step he did not intend. The white wolf sat. He looked at Jon with long patience. Jon laid his hand along the jaw that had once raked blood across a man who meant him harm. The sound came again, less a sound than a feeling of a low bell in the belly. He rose and went to the candle. He did not light it. He sat with his palm on the cool glass. He breathed in time with it, an old trick for making fear become a witness rather than an actor. He set his thoughts out as if they were a deck of cards he had not meant to draw and examined them one by one. The North is holding. Sansa is making the work small enough that men can carry it. The guys will try a subtler knife next. Volantis will applaud a clause and slip another under the table. The small dragons will grow teeth faster than I grow instruction. Drogon will go where no man would bid him not to, because he is himself. He set the last card down. He smiled at his own folly because he had not named the thing his body knew. That he was tired and that to admit it even to a glass might feel like complaining. He put his hand flat. He said with no words, I am here. He felt, perhaps only because the body is clever at consoling itself, the reply he had come to rely on. Sansa's hand on the back of his own, not soothing him like a child, but touching him like a worker touches a fellow's shoulder at the end of a shift and says, well done. Now sleep. He slept. Years do not pass in the space of a single page, and yet in the hall they learned to make pages that could carry years if men turned them carefully. Jon watched the small dragons grow to bear saddles they would never wear and pride they would never hide. He watched sprites die. Of age, of accidents, of the peculiar mischief of a city whose vents sometimes sighed at the wrong moment. And he buried them under a place where a mosaic showed fish because fish are people too in their way, and because the sprites liked to whistle at the fish when they were happy. He watched Sarah Glover kiss a sailor behind a broken column, and then pretend to fight him in the morning because the world had taught her to hide tenderness under noise. He watched Mael grow a streak of white in his hair after one night on a rope when a boat had decided to teach him humility. He watched Davos write a letter to a boy with his old name and not send it, yet read it to the candle and let the green hold it like a kindly aunt. He watched Sansa's North become itself again, not in songs but in loaves and roofs and inns built where roads crossed, small luxuries that made men's lives feel like their own. He watched from a distance a woman in Wintertown teach 3 girls to read numbers on a counting board because she had learned from one of Sansa's scribes that numbers held bread if you held them properly. He watched the maester who had insisted on coming to study stop insisting and start listening when he saw that knowledge here did not ask for his permission before it decided to be useful. He did not go to King's Landing. He did not write to a king. He wrote to a queen in the north and to men who made ropes and to women who could coax a thin soil to give 2 stalks where one had salt. He spoke to priests from the mother of mountains and let them lay their little discs at the base of a pillar because men who feel invited to lay something down are less likely to pick up a torch. He did not forget. He did not forgive much. He was not generous in ways that made other men comfortable. He was increasingly a man other people decided to explain to each other with phrases like he listens when the wind speaks and he is a wall and he is a bridge. He took none of those phrases into his cells and made them truth there. He carried his own simpler sentence. Keep the fire and do not let it burn the house. Darza Paul died, not in a battle, in a bed, which is a victory of a kind in her city and not cheap. A letter came by a courier who was paid in coin and in status and in the right to say he had spoken to the keeper of Valyria's bells. The letter was spare. It said she had left a small coffer with his name written in a clerk's hand that had pride in its curves. It said Ulthas the younger would try again, less politely, because he had grown tired of matching patience with men who did not fear him. It said a boy she had looked after had a talent for maps that did not involve drawing lines around what he wanted. Jon read it with his thumb on the snake hinge box's lid, and then set the letter in the candle's light until it bore a faint, honest green across its edge. Sansa wrote of sickness in the winter town that took 3 babies and frightened 10 mothers and made a father pound his fist on a table until he broke a knuckle because the world had no enemies he could reach. Rice sent a syrup and a way to heat it and a way to hold a child so her breath did not drown her. The next letter contained 4 names of babies who did not die. Jon read those names aloud to the small dragons, who did not understand names and yet tipped their heads as if they heard the particular gravity men give to that sound. Drogon took Jon across the sea one morning when the air had the clarity of a new blade and brought him down on a black tooth of rock that rose from a blue so deep it might have held all the sky's sorrow. They stood there, beast and man, and looked west. Jon thought he could see, just then, as if the world's skin had gone thin, the shape of the north under cloud. He thought of a girl of 13 watching a wolf dance in the yard and thinking it was a princess. He thought of a boy of 8 believing in honor as if it had been a magic that would stop a knife. He thought of himself at 20 standing before men and asking them to do the hard thing and finding that some did meanness and some did greatness for the same reasons. He breathed. He set his hand to the side of Drogon's neck. He said aloud softly, because the rock and the air could carry it to her, "I am where I must be." When they soared and turned east again, the sunlight caught the membranes of Drogon's wings. For a breath, they were not black at all, but ruby and garnet, and 1,000 reds stolen from a southern boy's cloak and from a mother who kept a shawl in a chest to remind her of summers. Jon laughed without permission, the sound lost in wind. Years do not pass in a page, but men pass years like pages when they read them with regard. The road between Winterfell and Valyria held. It was not visible on any map. It existed in ropes and bells and glass, in letters, in a wolf's tail thumping on stone as a dragon's wings stirred the air, in a woman's hands counting out flour, in a boy's gasp at a bell tuned to a dead man's laugh. Armies came and did not take it. Priests came and called it blessed or accursed, and then went away with their opinion intact and the road intact beside it. A fleet from Lys attempted honeyed war and went home with honey and less sting. A cohort of Sellswords arrived to claim a bounty from a man in Tyrosh who declared the Dragonkeeper had stolen his grandmother's comb. They joked, ate bread, and left with a story that would last them a winter. A certain maester grew old in Winterfell and confessed to his pupil that the thing which had frightened him in youth, the idea that knowledge might live beyond the ring he wore, had become comfort. He died the next spring, and Sansa spoke at his pyre, not in high words but in the language of work, and a woman listening found herself crying and did not feel ashamed. Jon grew streaks of silver over his ears. He did not notice until Sarah said, "You look like iron showing itself in snow," and he laughed and said, "That is either the ugliest compliment I have had or the truest," and she said, "Both," which satisfied them. He opened the box Darza had sent when Ulthas the Younger finally uncloaked his pettiness in public. The Triarch, now Triarch in full name, proclaimed Valyria a possession of whoever could set a foot on it with a writ. He produced a writ. He sent men with spears and with words sharpened to wound. He set 3 ships afloat all night with flame in braziers to show the world he was earnest. Jon watched the flames. He watched the men huddling against a night breeze that had a tooth. He watched a boy in the 3rd ship yawn and then looked terrified because he had been seen yawning by an officer. He walked into the hall. He lifted the lid. Inside lay not glass. A horn lay there. It was small. Smaller than the tales men told over wine and fear. It was not black like smoke, nor white like a whale's gift, but a deep brown with a grain that had once been living. It was bound at the thin end with a thong of something like leather that had not dried or cracked, and around the mouth of it, tiny marks had been cut in a repeating pattern script. It smelled, faintly, like the inside of a man's hand on a hot day, salt and skin and something metallic. He felt along the binding and found the place where a man had held it most. He did not blow it. He took it instead to the cloak cliff and set it down a little way from Drogon's talons. Drogon lowered his head. He huffed once, twice. He kept his eye very still. The little dragons were nowhere to be seen. They had learned not to come too near when things with age spoke to Drogon. Jon sat cross-legged and looked at the marks. They were repeating as a lullaby repeats, not to instruct but to remind. They said, "Here is a thing that can call if you let it." They said, "Here is a thing that can change a call into an order if a man who likes orders puts his mouth to it." They said, "Here is a thing that can be a bridge or a chain." Jon set his hand along the binding. He recognized the craft as he had recognized rope with wire and bells with grief. He did not put it to his mouth. He took it to the candle. He set it beside the green and let the light throw its gentle ghost along the horn's curve. He set his palm on the glass and his other hand on the horn and breathed. He did not ask for instruction. He did not ask for courage. He asked of himself whether he wanted the thing in the world changed by this instrument. He found that he did not like that. not by sending notes through air to tell a creature who would act anyway to act in a direction of a man's choosing. He had asked Drogon to lay shadow and to fly and to leave men. He had never pretended his asking was command. He would not begin. He set the horn back in the box. He closed the lid. He took the box, heavier now because he understood it, down to the tunnels and found a place where the stone had pooled after a second fire and cooled into a ripple like a calm sea. He set the box in the ripple. He took one of the glass sheets from the snake hinge and set it atop the box. He let the green light find the glass and then took his hand away. He did not hide what he had done. He told Sansa in a letter with 5 lines and no endearment and felt her hand on his again across the space like the simplest OS he had ever seen. Althaz's men set their feet on the sand and found it not ready to carry their writ. They found rope where they did not expect rope and bells whose patterns made their shoulders relax against their will, and they hated it, and then they found themselves breathing more easily anyway. They found towers without archers and the memory of a dragon's scream unuttered near them like thunder along bones. They found a man standing with a wolf and 2 creatures who were not yet quite beasts men would call mounts and were rather the stubborn winds of the place given scales. They found themselves no longer brave in the way of thin men and instead trying for the thicker kind. Some succeeded. More went home to explain why their writ had lost ink in the spray. Althaz died on a stair 14 months later, stabbed by a cousin with a chant tattooed on his tongue. Darza's boy became a man who traveled and never tried to tell anyone where to stand. The Carthene painted over their mouths in a new blue and declared an edict that no one read. The Volantines sent a robe too fine for any honest work. Rice cut it into strips to bind Drogon's wing when he tore it again for the sport of humiliating wind. The maester in Winterfell taught a girl to write her name on a wall with chalk, and the girl grew up to own an inn where the beer was very nearly honest. Jon saw Sansa grow older and stranger and more herself. He saw in her letters the way her hand learned to steady over sorrow faster. He saw her crown once more, 10 years to the day after he had set it on her head, and found the iron and moon-milk stones sitting easier in her hair than they had. He found in his own hands scars that had not been there and a steadiness that had. He spoke less to men who liked to hear their own plans and more to men who liked to hear bells. He crossed the sea less often. He did not feel needed the way he had at first. He was no less necessary. This was the plain contradiction of the work, that the better he and Sansa and the rest did it, the less they appeared in it, until a child could eat a piece of bread and not say thank you to any named person at all and still owe her life to 100 hands. He liked that. He did not mind being forgotten in the distribution of praise. He had known fame once and found it a poor blanket. He preferred a good cloak and an honest fire and a wolf who would not let him lie to himself. In the winter that came 5 years after he had opened the snake's hinge and refused the horn, a sickness took hold in Lys and traveled with men's hands and their hunger and their carelessness along ropes and mugs and tin cups. It reached Volantis and did not care for gods. It reached guys and did not care for pride. Captains sailed for Valyria not for writs or for glory, but because the rumor was that air over the vents burned things that latched to lungs. Jon did not close the harbor. He set beacons. He set ropes. He set Rice with a crown of sprigs on her head as a joke she did not find funny and gave her a table and a dozen small bowls and more water than he preferred and sent men from one bowl to the next, washing hands as if prayer was the work you did with fingers and not with words. The sickness came anyway. The beacons burned anyway. The bells rang patterns that laid a steady across panic. Men lived. Men died. No city conquered. No city burned. The road held. The green candle burned when he asked it to and did not loosen men's wits. Ghost slept by the doorway and rose when a foot fell wrong and was there under a sagging knee, wolf and prop and friend. The small dragons became not small and took themselves to a higher ledge and came down when men whistled in the key of patience. Drogon took to leaving at odd hours to places Jon did not know and returning with a soot on his muzzle that meant nothing good to men who keep track of fires. He groomed his own wing edges with care. He lay his head near Jon's shoulder sometimes and let the man lean because there is relief in resting against a mountain that chooses not to move. When Arya came a last time, She brought with her a smell of salt from a sea without a name men in the free cities would recognize. She brought with her 2 children with hair like rough silk and eyes that did not look down unless looking down kept them from stepping on a crab that scuttled swift. She stayed one night and was gone in the morning with a note pinned to the stable beam that said only a thing John put a hand to and held in his chest as if it needed the warmth. I went where maps end. My road had no beacons. I found stars enough. He went to Winterfell once more when a snow came early, not to fly above the cold but to feel it along his teeth. He stood with Sansa under the heart tree and did not ask if she'd slept. She did not ask if he'd eaten. Ghost walked circles in a pattern he had made as a pup and still remembered. The small dragons perched on the broken crown of the old tower as if it were made for them after all, and children in the yard below pointed and did not squeal because Stark children learned awe was a plain thing not to be wasted on shrieking. "What did you make?" Sansa asked at last, not turning to him, her eyes gone to the red flow in the carved face. "A road," he said. "And what did it make of you?" "A man who did not stop," he said. "Not even when I wanted to." She nodded, as if he had answered correctly. "Good," she said. "We cannot set children down on roads that end at the edge of a feeling." They stood until their breath made little ghosts that hurried away to whisper to the pines. He thought of time, which is a river that thinks itself ocean and sometimes is, and of men who are pebbles and think themselves ships and sometimes are. He thought of a crown sitting on a table and of hands in ink. He thought of a dragon warming his side at dusk. He thought, without grief, of a city that would never be whole and would be itself always, which was a better wholeness. He went back. He went back until the day came when his hair was more iron than night, when the small dragons had found mates that were not quite their mates and people that were not quite people under broken stairs who wore their shapes with comfort, when the bell-maker's son had tuned bells to his own mother's laugh because he had come to love it better than grief's honest key. He went back and kept a fire. He wrote fewer letters because now the road wrote them for him. A crate sent, a coil of rope returned, a pot of oil delivered to the right hands at the right tide. He lit the candle less often because he could feel the thread without looking and knew that when he set his palm on glass it was mostly to remind his breath to behave. He went back and did not one day. Not because he died, not because the storm took him, because he had trained men not to need the sight of him to keep their hands steady, and training is only proven when the trainer sits down. He sat. He watched a young woman with a scar at her mouth where a rope had burned her when she was small take a slate and mark a list of ships. He watched a boy with a strip of hair shaved down his head, now grown and proud, and not foolish sort crystals by sheen for rice. He watched Ghost bump a sprite lightly with his shoulder to knock it away from a vent that had decided to open that day because it had been closed yesterday and resented routine. He watched and found his heart in his body's quiet. When he closed his eyes for the last time, it was under the broken dome. Drogon lay like a hill beside him with his one good eye open and his one scarred wing half spread as if to make weather behave. The road held. The beacons burned their slow bells of light. The candles green made no claims on theology. The small dragons, now large enough that men stopped calling them small even in jest because jest began to feel disrespectful, slept on their ledge and dreamed. Jon hoped of men being and keeping and not ceasing. He let his breath out and did not gather it again. Sansa stood at the candle later with a hand not yet wrinkled and set her palm to the glass. She did not ask give him back. She did not ask for any of the childish things the world rightly refuses with kindness. She set her palm and said in the bones of her hand, which were stark bones and would not stop being, "Thank you." She went back to her desk. She wrote 3 letters and a decree and 2 notes that were only jokes to be tucked into bread. She crowned a child at a hearth with a circle of willow because his mother asked, and then she went out under the broken tower and looked at the dragons and said aloud so they might hear and understand in whatever way dragons do, "We will keep." The bells rang in the key of a dead man's laugh. The sprites whistled in a pattern that meant road and rope and home. The sea hit the teeth in the right way and went around them. The fire kept, and under a sky that had learned to share itself with wings, wolves slept warm in winter, and children in the north grew up knowing there was a long, invisible path across the water their maps did not show. and that if they held their breath and closed their eyes and counted the beats between one bell and the next, they might, just for a moment, feel it under their feet.